She didn't say a word. She just walked past every man who laughed at her, straight into that filthy kitchen, and she lit the stove. Nobody helped her. Nobody offered. 12 ranch hands stood outside that door and made their jokes about the big woman Caleb Whitmore had ordered from a letter agency like she was a piece of furniture that had arrived in the wrong size. She heard every word. She cooked anyway. And by 6 the next morning, when those same 12 men walked into the dining room expecting another plate of burnt nothing, they stopped cold. The smell alone shut every one of them up. Thomas Reed, 22 years on that ranch, the man who had said that's her. Then, like a verdict, the moment she stepped off the train, he sat down, took one bite, and didn't speak again until his plate was empty. Then he asked for more. Nobody laughed after that. But that was only the beginning, because a woman named Victoria Langley had spent 4 years planning to be the next Mrs. Whitmore, and she had a banker in her pocket, a land commissioner's wife on speed, and absolutely no intention of letting a quiet, plus-size woman from a letter agency take what she believed was hers. What happened next on the Whitmore Ranch would force every single person in Harlow Creek, Montana, to answer one question they had never thought to ask themselves. What exactly do you see when you look at a woman like Maggie? If this is your first time here, please subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss a story. Drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far Maggie's story travels. Now stay with me, because this woman is about to do something nobody on that ranch will forget for the rest of their lives. The morning Maggie arrived in Harlow Creek, Montana, the summer of 1882 was already brutal. The platform was crowded with people who had nothing better to do than watch the train come in. And when the door to the third passenger car opened and Maggie stepped onto the platform carrying her old leather suitcase in one hand and a small wooden recipe box tucked under her other arm, the crowd went quiet for about 2 full seconds before the murmuring started. She was 25 years old. She was tall. She was heavy in the way that some people spent their whole lives being cruel about, the kind of build that made strangers feel entitled to an opinion. Her dark hair was pinned back neatly. Her dress was clean, though clearly mended more than once, and her face, the face nobody bothered to look at properly because they were too busy forming judgments about everything else, was calm. Still. The kind of still that comes not from ignorance but from a woman who had been stared at long enough to stop being surprised by it. She stepped onto the platform, adjusted the strap of her suitcase, looked around the town of Harlow Creek with those steady brown eyes, and waited. Caleb Whitmore was leaning against the post at the far end of the platform, hat pulled low, arms crossed, looking like a man who had agreed to something and was already halfway through regretting it. He was 38, broad-shouldered, with a jaw that hadn't seen a proper shave in 3 days and eyes that were somewhere between tired and hollow in the way that grief does to a man over years of slow accumulation. He had owned the Whitmore Ranch for 15 years. He had been a widower for 4. And 3 weeks ago, after a season of failed crops, a kitchen that produced nothing worth eating, and a crew of 12 men who were running on poor sleep and worse meals, he had written a letter to a placement agency in St. Louis and asked for a woman who could cook and manage a household. He had not asked for much else. The agency had sent Maggie. He pushed off the post and walked toward her, and she saw him coming and stood her ground in that quiet way she had, not shrinking, not performing. Just standing there like a woman who had learned a long time ago that there was no point in trying to be smaller than she was. "Miss Holloway," he said. "Mr. Whitmore," she said. He looked at her for a moment. She looked back at him. Neither of them said anything that might pass for warmth, but neither of them said anything cruel either, and in a town like Harlow Creek, on a platform with half the county watching and whispering, that counted for something. He took her suitcase without asking, which surprised her. She kept the recipe box. "Wagons out front," he said. "It's about an hour's ride." "All right," she said. That was the whole of it. That was their introduction. A man who didn't know how to offer comfort, and a woman who didn't need it performed for anyone. They walked off that platform together while the crowd watched and whispered and made their predictions, and not one single prediction was kind. The ride to the ranch was mostly silence, broken once by Caleb asking if she'd had any trouble on the train and once by Maggie asking how many men she'd be cooking for. 3 meals a day. The kitchen's in rough shape. She nodded and looked out at the flat land, stretching in every direction, and said nothing more. And he didn't push her, because he was a man who had never known quite what to do with conversation that didn't involve livestock or weather or the price of cattle. What he didn't say, what he hadn't told the agency, what he hadn't told anyone, was how bad things had gotten. The truth was the Whitmore Ranch should have been thriving. The land was good, the cattle were strong, the men were experienced. But for the last year, something had gone out of the place. The rhythm of it, the life. Since the last housekeeper left 8 months ago, the kitchen had been run by rotation, which meant it had been run badly. Which meant the men came in from 14-hour days and sat down to half-burnt beans and bread that could have been used to shoe a horse. They ate it because they were hungry. They stopped talking at meals because there was nothing to celebrate. They stopped looking forward to coming inside because inside had stopped feeling like anything worth looking forward to. 12 men who were tired and underfed and unappreciated had quietly begun to turn against each other. Small arguments, short tempers. A crew that had once worked together like a single machine was starting to crack along its seams. And Caleb, who noticed everything about his land and almost nothing about his people, had hired a mail-order bride not because he wanted a wife, but because he needed someone to fix what was breaking. He hadn't considered that the woman he hired might notice everything too. They arrived at the ranch as the sun was beginning to drop, and Maggie got down from the wagon before Caleb could come around to offer his hand. She picked up her recipe box, looked at the house, looked at the bunkhouse beyond it, looked at the barn, looked at the men who had drifted over from various parts of the property to get a look at the new arrival, and did the same thing she'd done on the platform. She stood. She took it in. She said nothing. The men stared. Thomas Reed was the first to say something, because Thomas Reed had been on the Whitmore Ranch for 22 years and had developed the particular confidence of a man who believed his opinion was always welcome. He was 60, weathered, with the kind of face that had spent decades deciding things about people in the first 30 seconds of meeting them. He looked at Maggie and then looked at Caleb and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "That's her then." Not a question, not a greeting, a verdict. Maggie turned and looked at him the way you look at a man who just said something he thinks is clever. "That's me," she said, and her voice was even, no apology in it. No flinching. Thomas didn't know what to do with that. He made a sound in the back of his throat and looked away. Beside him, a younger man named Del Purvis, who was 26 and had the kind of mouth that got him in trouble in every town he'd ever passed through, leaned toward the man next to him and said something low that made 3 of the others snicker. Maggie heard it. She didn't look at him. She picked up her suitcase and walked toward the house. Caleb caught up to her on the porch. "Don't mind them," he said, which was the closest he knew how to get to an apology for other men's behavior. "I don't," she said, which was the truth. He showed her through the house the way a man shows someone a thing he's been neglecting, and knows it quickly, with minimal commentary, hoping the pace will prevent too much scrutiny. The parlor was fine. The bedrooms were acceptable. The kitchen was a different matter entirely. Maggie walked into the kitchen and stopped. The stove had a crack running along the left side of the firebox. 2 of the cabinet doors were missing their hinges. The pantry shelves held about a third of what they should have, most of it poorly organized and in need of an inventory. The table had a wobble that suggested someone had known about it for months and done nothing. The whole room had the feeling of a place that had been used but never cared for, like a coat worn every day and never once brushed. Caleb stood in the doorway, watching her take it all in. "I know it needs some work," he said. Maggie set her recipe box on the table, very carefully, like she was setting it on an altar. Then she ran her hand along the edge of the stove and looked at the crack, and looked at the pantry, and looked at the hinges lying on the floor beside the cabinet, because someone had taken them off and simply set them down and walked away. She turned to Caleb. "What time do the men eat in the morning?" He blinked. 6. "What's in the smokehouse?" he told her. "What's been going out to them for breakfast?" He told her that too, and to his credit he looked briefly ashamed of it. She nodded. "I'll need some things from town tomorrow. I'll make a list tonight." She looked at the stove again. "Can someone look at this firebox? I can work around the crack tonight, but it needs to be repaired." "I'll have someone out tomorrow," he said. "Good." She turned back to the pantry and began going through what was there with the focused efficiency of a woman who had spent her whole life making enough out of not enough. "I'll have something on the table by 6. "You don't have to start tonight," Caleb said, and he said it in a way that might have been consideration for her long journey, or might have been doubt about her ability to produce anything worth eating. Maggie chose to hear the first and dismissed the second without comment. "I know I don't have to," she said. "I want to." He left her to it. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Maggie had been cooking since she was 8 years old. Her mother had taught her, and her mother's mother had taught her mother, and somewhere in that line of women passing down not just recipes but the understanding that food was the most fundamental form of care, Maggie had absorbed something that couldn't be taught in any cookbook or hotel kitchen. She knew how to cook for tired people. She knew what a hungry man needed that wasn't just calories. She knew that the difference between a meal that sustained a body and a meal that restored a spirit was attention. Was the small, deliberate acts of someone who noticed that one man liked his eggs cooked through and another liked them soft, that one preferred his coffee dark and strong while another needed it barely past hot water. That the youngest man at the table ate fast because he'd grown up in a house where you ate fast or you didn't eat. She moved through that broken kitchen with the calm competence of someone completely at home in chaos, and by the time the light outside was fully gone, something was happening on the stove that had not happened in that kitchen for a very long time. Not just food, a meal. She had found a piece of salt pork and a jar of dried beans and 2 aging onions and a heel of bread, and she had done what her mother always called making something out of nearly nothing, which was less about ingredients and more about patience. She set a slow pot going, mixed together enough cornbread batter to fill the cast iron twice over, and sat down at the wobbling table with a candle and her recipe box and began writing her list for the morning. She wrote for a long time. In the bunkhouse, the men were talking. Del Purvis was holding court, which he did at every opportunity, because he mistook volume for authority. "Caleb's lost his mind," he said, leaning back on his bunk with his boots still on, which was a habit that drove Thomas Reed halfway to murder on a regular basis. "Bringing that woman here, what's she supposed to do? She can barely fit through the kitchen door." Nobody laughed as loudly as he'd expected. A young man named Eli Parker, who was 17 and had been on the ranch for 8 months and was still figuring out how to exist in a room full of men who mostly ignored him, looked down at his hands and said nothing. Thomas Reed, who was sitting at the small table near the door playing solitaire with a deck missing the 7 of spades, laid down a card without looking up. "She cook something?" he said to nobody in particular. A man named Frank Guthrie, who had the bunk closest to the door, sniffed the air. He was a quiet man, Frank, not prone to commentary. But he sniffed again and said, "Yeah, she cooked something." Del kept talking. Nobody kept listening. The smell coming from the main house was doing something to the room that Del's words couldn't compete with, and one by one the men got quiet the way men do when their bodies start paying attention to something their pride hasn't caught up with yet. At 6 the next morning the table was set. Maggie had been up since 4. She had fixed the problem with the firebox well enough to manage through breakfast. She had reorganized the pantry completely and written her inventory on folded piece of paper now tucked into her apron pocket. And she had cooked what was available into something that bore no resemblance to what had been coming out of that kitchen for months. Fresh biscuits, a full pot of good coffee, eggs, real eggs, from the chickens in the yard that she had discovered were producing fine, but whose eggs had been collected inconsistently and poorly tracked. Sliced salt pork cooked until the fat was properly rendered and the edges were just barely crisp. A pot of last night's beans finished through the morning into something that had developed depth and warmth in the hours of slow cooking. She stood at the stove when the men came in. She did not announce anything. She did not perform a greeting. She had plates on the table and food in the pot, and she kept her eyes on the stove and let the food speak first, because the food, she had always believed, was better at introductions than she was. They came through the door expecting disappointment. They stopped. Thomas Reed was at the front of the group, as he always was, because Thomas moved to the front of every group without thinking about it, because 22 years on one ranch made a man feel like the walls knew his name. He stopped inside the door and the man behind him walked into his back, and there was a brief shuffle of large men adjusting themselves in a doorway, and then they all went still. The smell hit them the way a memory hits you sudden and complete, like something that was always there and just needed unlocking. Thomas walked to the table. He looked at the food. He looked at Maggie's back, because she still hadn't turned around from the stove. He pulled out his chair and sat down. He picked up his fork. He ate one bite of the biscuit, and the room around him existed in complete silence while he chewed. He swallowed. He cut the next bite. He ate that one too. "Sit down," he said, to the men behind him. And his voice was different from the voice it had been last night, and everyone in the room noticed even if no one commented. They sat. They ate. Maggie moved between the stove and the table refilling coffee and setting out the next batch of biscuits she'd been holding warm in the oven, and not one man said a word that wasn't please or thank you, which in a room full of men who had spent months barely acknowledging the existence of meals was nothing short of extraordinary. Eli Parker ate 3 biscuits. He ate them slowly, carefully, without speaking. His shoulders dropped a full inch from where they'd been when he walked in, and at the end of the meal, when Maggie collected the plates, he looked up at her and said, "Thank you, ma'am," in a voice so quiet and sincere that Del Purvis, sitting 2 seats down, suddenly found something very interesting to look at on the far wall. Maggie looked at Eli. "You're welcome," she said, and she meant it the way people mean things when they've watched someone be hungry for a while and finally have the chance to do something about it. Caleb was the last one to eat. He came in when the men were mostly done, poured himself coffee from the pot she'd kept warm, and sat at the head of the table and ate what remained on the plates she'd set aside for him. He ate without theatrics, without compliment. He cleaned his plate, drank his coffee, and when he stood to leave for the morning's work, he stopped at the door. "It was good," he said. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. He left. She stood in that kitchen alone for a moment with the sound of 12 men filing out to work, and she looked at the empty plates and the clean table and the stove with its cracked firebox. And she felt something settle in her chest that she hadn't been sure she'd ever feel in this place. Not victory, not vindication, not the satisfaction of having proven something. Just the quiet sense of being in the right place and doing the right thing. The feeling of being useful to people who needed something she actually had to give. She picked up the stack of plates and got started on the dishes. The week that followed was a war Maggie fought without weapons anyone could see. The kitchen was her first project. She worked on it the way she worked on everything, methodically, without drama, attacking each problem in order of urgency. The stove was repaired on the second day, a ranch hand named Gus, who turned out to have some facility with metalwork, spending 2 hours on it while she told him exactly what the problem was and what it needed. And he did what she said, and the stove ran clean for the first time in months. The cabinet hinges went back on by end of the first week. The pantry was organized in a system she mapped on paper, inventory tracked so she could see at a glance what was getting low and what needed ordering. She submitted her first supply list to Caleb on the 3rd morning, 5 pages, organized by category, with estimated cost beside each item. He looked at it for a long time. "This is more than I expected," he said. "I know," she said. "Some of it is catching up. Once we're stocked properly, the ongoing cost will be lower." He looked at her over the top of the list. "You know what things cost." "I've managed a household budget since I was 19, she said. I know what things cost. He looked at the list a moment more. Then he folded it and put it in his chest pocket. I'll send it with the next supply run, he said. She gave him a small nod and turned back to the stove, and she heard him hesitate in the doorway, the way people hesitate when they want to say something they haven't quite formed into words yet. And then she heard his boots cross the porch, and that was the end of it. What Caleb was thinking, alone in his office that night with the list spread open on the desk in front of him, was something he wasn't entirely comfortable with. He was thinking that he had not expected this. He had expected functional. He had expected serviceable, a woman who would keep the kitchen running and the men fed adequately and manage the domestic side of the ranch without requiring much of his attention. He had not expected organized. He had not expected precise. He had not expected a woman who walked into a failing kitchen on the night of her arrival and had it producing honest food by the following morning, who submitted a 5-page supply list with cost breakdowns, who moved through a room full of hostile strangers with the composure of a woman who had already decided they weren't going to diminish her. He had not expected her. He looked at the list for a long time before he folded it back up and put it away. Meanwhile, the bunkhouse continued its negotiations. Del Purvis had gone quiet on the subject of Maggie's appearance, mostly because he had noticed that the volume of his commentary was inversely related to the quality of what ended up on his plate. And he was not so stupid that he failed to see the connection. He still didn't like her. He had built his dislike of her in the first 5 seconds of meeting her, and he wasn't the kind of man who let evidence get in the way of a good solid prejudice. But he had stopped talking about it out loud, which was as close to progress as Del Purvis got. Thomas Reed had gone the other direction entirely, which surprised him. He caught himself watching her work through the kitchen window more than once. Not in any way that was inappropriate. Thomas Reed was not that kind of man, but in the way you watch someone do something they're very good at, with the particular admiration of a craftsman observing another craftsman's technique. She moved through that kitchen with an efficiency that was almost architectural. She never wasted a step. She timed things by some internal clock that never seemed to be wrong. She could have 4 things cooking at different stages and hold the schedule of all of them in her head without writing any of it down. And somehow the result was always something that came together at the right moment, with everything done to exactly the right point. Thomas had been on the ranch for 22 years, and he had seen cooks come and go, good ones and bad ones and worse ones, and what he was watching was something rarer than any of them. He didn't say this to anyone, because Thomas Reed was a man who revealed things in his own time, and only when he was absolutely sure they were true. He watched, he waited. He kept his own counsel. Eli Parker, who was not old enough to have anyone's counsel but his own, had taken to arriving in the kitchen 20 minutes before breakfast on the pretext of needing to refill the water bucket, which was housed outside and did not require him to be in the kitchen. Maggie noticed this on the second day and said nothing about it. She put him to work instead, handing him tasks: carry this, stir this, hold this, while he did everything she asked with a seriousness that would have been funny in another context, but in this one was simply the behavior of a boy who had found something solid to hold on to and wasn't going to let go of it. She noticed on the 4th morning that he had stopped putting biscuits in his pockets. She had seen it the first morning, the quick, practiced movement of slipping a biscuit into the coat pocket, casual, accustomed, the gesture of someone who had been doing it long enough that it didn't feel like stealing anymore, just insurance. She recognized it because she had seen it before, in different kitchens, in different contexts, always the same underlying meaning. The person who does this is afraid that tomorrow there won't be enough. On the 4th morning, when the biscuits came out of the oven and Eli Parker, standing beside the stove in his 20 minutes early capacity, reached for one automatically and then stopped and put it on his plate instead, Maggie said nothing. She kept her eyes on the pan. She felt something shift in her chest like a door opening. She had not fixed everything. She was not naive about how much was still broken in this place, in this house, in the fractured relationship between its owner and the 12 men who worked for him, and the long absence of any kind of care that hadn't been extracted by force or obligation. But she had done something in 4 days that the place had not been able to do for itself in a year. She had made a boy stop hiding food. That counted. That counted for something real. The crisis came at the end of the second week. It came from town, which was where most crises of a particular kind came from, delivered in the form of Victoria Langley, who arrived at the Whitmore Ranch on a Wednesday afternoon in a buggy that was too expensive for a routine social call and too insistent for a friendly visit. Maggie didn't know who Victoria Langley was when the woman stepped out of that buggy. She was upstairs changing the linens on the bedroom that had been designated as the guest room. And she heard the wheels and the hoofbeats and looked out the window and saw a woman she didn't recognize down with the careful precision of someone who had learned to make every entrance look deliberate. Victoria Langley was 40, beautiful, in the way that required considerable effort to maintain, and dressed in a manner that communicated wealth and standing to anyone within eyeline. She was the widow of a man who had left her with a substantial house and property on the east edge of Harlow Creek, and she had spent the 4 years since his death deciding, with the certainty of someone who has never had that certainty challenged, that Caleb Whitmore was eventually going to recognize what was in front of him and marry her. The arrival of Maggie had upset this plan considerably. Victoria walked up to the front door and knocked, and Maggie came downstairs and opened it, and the two women looked at each other. "Mrs. Whitmore," Victoria said, and she said it in a tone that put about 3 separate objections inside the 2 words. "Miss Holloway," Maggie said, because she hadn't fully accepted the other name yet. "Can I help you?" Victoria looked at her in the particular way of someone cataloging information they intend to use later. She looked at Maggie's work apron and the flour on her hands and the fact that she had been upstairs doing linens on a Wednesday afternoon, and Maggie watched all of this happening and waited. "I've come to call on Caleb," Victoria said. "He's out at the south pasture," Maggie said. "I'm not sure what time he'll be back. Would you like to come in and wait?" There was a pause in which Victoria assessed the invitation and everything behind it. "I'll wait," she said. Maggie stepped back and let her in and led her to the parlor and offered her coffee, which Victoria accepted in a tone that made the acceptance feel like a criticism. And then Maggie went back to the kitchen and made coffee and thought about what she had just let into the house. She was not a suspicious woman by nature. She had no reason to distrust a woman she'd just met. But she had a very well-developed instinct for the shape of situations, developed over years of being a woman who was underestimated in almost every room she entered, and the shape of this situation had a particular feeling to it. The feeling of something that was coming, regardless of whether she was ready. She brought the coffee to the parlor. Victoria was seated on the good chair by the window, the one that faced the room rather than the wall, the one that gave you a view of whoever entered. And Maggie noticed this because she noticed these things. The way people positioned themselves in rooms and what it told you about what they wanted. Victoria accepted the coffee and then looked at Maggie with the directness of someone who had decided to skip the preamble. "You're not quite what I expected," she said. Maggie sat down in the chair across from her. "No," she said. "People usually aren't." Victoria tilted her head slightly. "How are you finding ranch life?" "I'm finding it suits me," Maggie said. Really, Victoria took a sip of coffee, and the pause she placed after it was not accidental. "I've known Caleb for many years. He's a man of particular tastes." "Most people are," Maggie said. Victoria set her cup down with a precision that said she was done with small maneuvering. "What I mean to say," she said, "is that a man like Caleb, his position in this community, the kind of woman who would properly complement that position, it's not something that should be left to a letter agency." Maggie looked at her for a moment. "Are you trying to tell me something, Mrs. Langley?" Victoria met her eyes. "I'm suggesting that there are people better suited to this role than..." She stopped. She gestured, briefly and dismissively, in Maggie's general direction. "Than me," Maggie said. "I'm simply being honest," Victoria said, with the smile of someone who uses honesty as a weapon and calls it virtue. Maggie looked at her a moment longer. She was aware of the space between her ribs where a different kind of woman might have felt that land as a wound. She was aware of the particular cruelty of the gesture, the small wave of the hand, as though Maggie were a chair someone had placed in the wrong room. She was aware of all of it, and then she set her hands in her lap and said very calmly, "Mrs. Langley, I've been here 2 weeks. In those 2 weeks, I've repaired a kitchen, fed 12 men 3 meals a day, organized a supply system, and made sure that nobody on this ranch goes to sleep hungry. I'm not particularly interested in whether that meets your standard for the role. I'm interested in whether it meets theirs." Victoria stared at her. "Good. I'll let Caleb know you came by," she said. "Would you like more coffee before you go?" Victoria left without the second cup. Maggie stood on the porch and watched the buggy disappear down the road, and then went back inside to finish the linens. And she felt the shape of what had just happened settle into the same category as everything else she had faced since stepping off that train. People who decided they knew what she was before they knew who she was. She had been handling that her whole life. She went back upstairs and finished the linens. That night, after supper, when the men had gone back to the bunkhouse and Caleb had retreated to his office as he did every evening, Maggie sat at the kitchen table with her recipe box open in front of her and her candle burning and wrote 3 letters, one to her sister in Kansas City, one to her former employer who had given her the reference for the placement agency, and one to the agency itself, which she had promised to update at the 30-day mark. She was writing the 3rd letter when she heard the footstep in the doorway. She didn't startle. She just looked up. Caleb was standing in the door with an empty coffee cup in his hand, which was transparently a reason to be in the kitchen rather than an actual need for coffee. Because the pot was cold and she could see from the angle of his body that he'd been standing in the doorway for at least a few seconds before she looked up. "Victoria Langley came by today," Maggie said. "I heard," he said. He came in and set the cup on the counter in that gesture men do when they want something to do with their hands. "She say something to you?" "Nothing I wasn't prepared for," Maggie said. He was quiet for a moment. She watched him try to figure out what to do with that answer, whether it needed for action from him, whether he was expected to apologize for someone else's behavior or simply acknowledge that he knew about it. He started. "You don't need to explain it," Maggie said. Not unkindly. "Just clean, I understand the situation." "I'm not troubled by it," he looked at her. "You sure about that?" "Mr. Whitmore," she said, "I've been too large for rooms my whole life. Too quiet, too plain, too much of some things and not enough of others according to whoever was doing the counting that week. Mrs. Langley is not the first person to look at me and decide I don't fit." She looked back at her letter. "She won't be the last." Caleb stood in the kitchen in the dim light of her candle, and he didn't say anything for a long moment, and then he said, "You fit here." She looked up. He looked like a man who had surprised himself. He had his arms crossed the way he did when he was uncertain of something, and his jaw was set in that particular way of a man, trying to look like he didn't just say something that mattered. And his eyes had that quality they got, sometimes when he was near the kitchen, less hollow than usual. She looked at him for a moment. "Good night, Mr. Whitmore," she said. He set the empty cup down and walked back down the hall. She looked at the kitchen door for a moment after he was gone. Then, she looked down at her letter and finished writing it, and when she was done, she folded it neatly, and blew out the candle and sat in the dark kitchen for just a minute, listening to the sounds of the ranch settling into night. She was not a woman given to sentiment. She was not a woman who had arrived on this ranch expecting to find anything other than work and shelter, and the slow accumulation of something stable. But Caleb Whitmore had stood in her kitchen with an empty cup and told her she fit, and she was honest enough with herself to admit that it had gone somewhere behind her ribs and stayed there. She sat in the dark for another minute. Then she went to bed. The morning after Caleb told her she fit, Maggie woke up before 4 and lay in the dark for exactly 2 minutes before she got up. She was not a woman who stayed in bed with her thoughts. Thoughts needed something to do, or they turned on you, and she had learned that early. She got up, dressed, and walked to the kitchen. And she stood in front of the stove she had learned like a second language over the past 2 weeks, and started the fire and put the coffee on, and began the quiet mathematics of feeding 12 men before the sun came up. She did not think about what Caleb had said. She thought about it constantly. She cracked eggs and thought about his voice when he said it. The particular flatness of it that she was starting to understand was not coldness, but the way a man speaks when something surprises him into sincerity. She cut the salt pork and thought about the way he'd looked like he wanted to take it back and then hadn't, the way his arms had stayed crossed while his eyes said something his posture was trying to contradict. She set the biscuit dough and thought, firmly and finally, that she was being foolish. That a man offering a practical assessment of a practical arrangement was not a declaration of anything. And that Margaret Holloway had not come to Montana to become someone who reads significance into empty coffee cups. She put the biscuits in the oven and told herself she was done thinking about it. She thought about it 3 more times before breakfast was on the table. The men came in at 6, and they came in differently than they had on that first morning. The first morning had been cautious, the shuffle of men who expected disappointment and were trying not to let hope embarrass them. 3 weeks in, they came in the way people come into a place they've decided to trust, not running. Not careless, but without bracing themselves first. They hung their hats on the hooks she'd put up beside the door, because the hooks hadn't been there before, and putting them up had one of the small practical things she'd done without announcement. And now the hats went on the hooks the way it had always been done that way. Thomas Reed sat in his chair, which was his chair now in the way that chairs become assigned in any house where the same people eat at the same table every day. He poured his own coffee because he knew where it was and how she kept it, and he drank it without comment, which was Thomas's version of deep appreciation. Del Purvis came in last, as he had started doing, because coming in last meant he didn't have to be the first to show on his face that he was glad to be there. He was a man of small and transparent strategies. Maggie had mapped all of them by the end of the first week and found them more sad than threatening. Eli Parker sat down and ate his biscuits off the plate. No pockets. She noticed every morning and said nothing every morning, and it was enough. Caleb didn't come in for breakfast. This happened sometimes. When the work started early or something needed his attention before the day properly began, he would take coffee in his office and eat when he came in for the midday meal, or sometimes not until supper. Maggie had learned his rhythms the same way she learned everyone else's, by watching without making a production of it, by paying attention to what was actually happening rather than what she expected to happen. She had learned that Caleb Whitmore was a man who carried a great deal alone because he had never found anyone he trusted to carry anything with him. She kept his plate warm and went about the morning. The second crisis of the week came before noon. It came in the form of Frank Guthrie, who was usually the quietest man on the ranch, and whose silence Maggie had come to read as steadiness. Frank was 44, built like a fence post, and had the contained quality of a man who had spent his whole life making himself smaller than his size suggested. He came into the kitchen at 10 in the morning, which was not his usual time, and stood in the doorway without speaking. Maggie looked up from the bread she was kneading. "Frank," she said. "Ma'am," he said. He had his hat in his hands, and he was turning it by the brim, which told her everything she needed to know about the state he was in before he said another word. "Sit down," she said. He sat. He put the hat on the table and looked at it. She kept kneading and waited. "Eli took a fall," he said. "Off the fence post in the east quarter. He's all right," he added quickly because her hands had stopped. "Landed wrong, twisted his wrist pretty bad. Gus says it don't look broke, but it's swollen up something fierce." Maggie's hands resumed. "Bunkhouse." He didn't want to. He didn't want to make a fuss about it. "Of course he didn't," she said. She finished the section of dough she was working on, covered it, and wiped her hands on her apron. She went to the cabinet she'd reorganized and pulled out the cloth she used for wraps and the small jar of saintev she'd brought in her suitcase because she believed in being prepared for the particular kinds of injuries that came with the work men did on ranches. Frank watched her move around the kitchen with that efficient certainty she had, and something shifted in his face. You already had that stuff ready, he said. Someone always gets hurt sooner or later, she said. Might as well be ready. She went to the bunkhouse. Eli was sitting on his bunk with his right wrist cradled against his chest, trying to look like it didn't hurt, which it clearly did enormously. He was 17. He had the expressive face of someone who hadn't yet learned to hide things and was actively embarrassed about that fact. Not bad, he said when she came in. Let me see it, she said. He held it out. It was swollen significantly, the kind of swelling that comes fast and means business, and there was bruising starting along the outside of the wrist that would be impressive by morning. She examined it carefully, watching his face when she pressed different points, reading the shape of his response. Not broken, but badly wrenched, the tendons and ligaments protesting their treatment in the most emphatic way available to them. You're right, she said. It's not bad. It's also going to hurt considerably for the next week and a half if you don't let it rest. I got work. Eli, she said. She said it in the particular voice she used when she meant business without raising it. He stopped. You're going to let me wrap this and you're going to keep it elevated for the rest of today, and tomorrow you'll tell me how it feels before you decide what you can and cannot do. All right? Yes, ma'am, he said quietly. She wrapped the wrist with the competence of someone who had done it before, and when she was done, she told him to keep the ice from the box on it in shifts and to come to the kitchen for lunch instead of going back out. And she left him sitting on his bunk looking slightly stunned in the way of a boy who had not expected someone to simply take care of him without making him ask for it. Frank was waiting outside the bunkhouse. Good, he said. He'll be fine, she said. He needs to stay off it today. Can you make sure he actually does that? Frank looked at her for a moment with that contained, careful expression of his. Yes, ma'am, he said, in a voice that sounded a little like Eli's had, the voice of someone who wasn't accustomed to being asked to help with something that actually mattered. Thank you, Frank, she said. She went back to the kitchen and uncovered her dough. What she didn't see, because she had already turned back to the house, was Frank standing outside the bunkhouse for a moment after she left, looking at the space she'd occupied, with an expression on his face that was doing something complicated and private. He put his hat back on. He went and found the others working the east pasture fence, and he didn't say much about it, because Frank never said much about anything. But when Del Purvis made a comment at lunch about Eli getting special treatment, it was Frank who looked at him across the table with a look so flat and final that Del picked up his fork and stopped talking and didn't try again. Caleb heard about Eli's wrist at noon. He came in from the north pasture and Thomas Reed told him in the straightforward way. Thomas conveyed information factually, without editorial, and Caleb went directly to the kitchen, where Maggie was at the stove, managing the midday meal with Eli sitting at the kitchen table with his wrapped wrist propped on a folded cloth, eating a bowl of soup she'd put in front of him an hour ago. Caleb looked at the wrist. He looked at Maggie. He looked at the soup. He said to Eli, "You all right?" "Yes, sir," Eli said. Miss Holloway fixed it up. Caleb looked at Maggie again. "Thank you," he said. And he said it in the tone she was starting to recognize, the one where the words were plain but the weight behind them was anything but. "He needs to rest it today," she said. "I told him he could help me in the kitchen this afternoon instead of going back out." There was a brief silence in which Caleb processed the idea of one of his ranch hands spending the afternoon in the kitchen. "All right," he said. He poured himself coffee. He sat at the table, not in his usual chair but at the end closest to Eli. And the three of them occupied the kitchen in a configuration that hadn't existed before, and that Maggie was aware of. In particular, she was aware of every shift in the shape of things in that house quietly, without showing it. "How's the north fence coming?" she asked, because she had learned that Caleb talked more freely when he was talking about the work, and the work was always a way into the other things that needed saying. He said. He drank his coffee. 3 sections need full replacement, not just repair. We don't have the posts for it yet. When does the supply run go? Thursday. I'll have my list ready by Wednesday night, she said. He looked at her. "You always have it ready." "I like being ready," she said. Something moved across his face that might have been the beginning of something like a smile. It didn't fully arrive, but it came closer than she'd seen before. "I noticed," he said. The twist came on Thursday, and it came in the form of a conversation she was not meant to hear. The supply wagon had gone into town. Maggie had a quieter morning than usual, the kitchen running on the rhythm she'd established enough that she could move through the necessary tasks with part of her mind somewhere else. She was in the pantry taking inventory when she heard boots on the porch and voices she recognized coming around the side of the house, close enough to the kitchen window that the words arrived clearly whether she wanted them to or not. Del Purvis and a man named Ray Coulter, who had worked the ranch for 3 years and had the particular character of someone who follows whoever seems most confident at the time. "Langley's going to do something about it," Del was saying. "I heard from Jessie at the feed store that she's been talking to people, saying Caleb made a mistake, that the agency misrepresented what they were sending." "What's that mean?" Ray said. "Means she wants the woman gone," Del said. "And Victoria Langley generally gets what she wants." A pause. The sound of them settling against the porch rail the way men do when they intend to keep talking. "You think she can do something?" Ray said. "She's got the banker's ear," Del said. "Caleb's got 3 notes coming due in the fall. If Langley puts pressure on Hendricks at the bank, he stops. Let the implication sit." "She wouldn't do that," Ray said, but his voice said he wasn't sure. "She's been waiting 4 years for that man to come to his senses," Del said. "She ain't going to let some big-boned woman from a letter agency get in the way of that." Maggie stood in the pantry with her inventory list in her hand and heard all of it. She did not move. She let the voices drift on, Del spinning out his theories in the confident tone of a man who mistakes gossip for insight, until they eventually moved off toward the barn and the kitchen went quiet again. She stood there for another 30 seconds. Then she put her inventory list on the shelf, walked to the stove, checked the pot she had going for the midday meal, and stood with her hand on the handle and let the full weight of what she'd just heard settle. Caleb had notes due at the bank. Victoria Langley had the banker's ear. And a man with financial vulnerability could be pressured into decisions he wouldn't otherwise make. She was not naive about this. She had grown up in a world that operated on exactly these kinds of pressures, money and influence, and the way the two combined to make people do things they told themselves were practical rather than cowardly. She knew what it looked like when a person's circumstances became a lever that someone else wanted to use. The question was what she was going to do with the information. She could tell Caleb what she'd heard. She could stay quiet and wait to see if anything came of it. She could begin preparing herself for the possibility that this arrangement was more fragile than she'd let herself believe. She thought about Eli's wrist and the hooks by the door and the way Thomas Reed said please when he wanted more coffee. She stirred the pot and made a decision. She was not going to let this place go without a fight. Not because of her own position, though she would be lying if she said that didn't matter. But because she had walked into a house full of people who had forgotten how to be cared for, and she had spent 3 weeks reminding them what it felt like, and she was not going to let a woman with a banker's ear undo that. She would need to know more. She would need to understand the exact shape of the financial situation. And to understand that, she would need to have a conversation with Caleb that went considerably further than the practical exchanges they'd managed so far. She thought about that for the rest of the afternoon. She thought about it through the midday meal and the afternoon baking and the supper preparations. And by the time the men had eaten and the kitchen was clean and the house was settling into its evening quiet, she had worked out how she was going to begin. She made 2 cups of coffee. She walked down the hall and knocked on the office door. A beat of silence, then, "Come in." She pushed the door open with her shoulder because her hands were full. Caleb was at the desk, with papers spread in front of him and his reading glasses on, which she had not seen for he must have heard her coming, and had an opportunity to remove them but he hadn't, which she noted without comment. He looked up. "I made coffee," she said. "I can see that," he said. But he moved the papers aside enough to make room, and she put one cup on the desk and sat down in the chair across from him without being invited to, which she had learned was the only way to sit in that chair, because he would never be the one to invite anyone into his difficulties. He took the coffee. He looked at her over the rim. "Something on your mind?" he said. "Yes," she said. "Can I ask you something direct?" He set the cup down. Something in his posture shifted, the way a man adjusts when he knows a conversation is going to require his full attention. "Go ahead," he said. "The notes at the bank," she said. "The ones due in the fall. How bad is it?" The silence that followed lasted long enough that she thought he might simply not answer. He looked at her for a moment, with an expression that was somewhere between wariness and something she couldn't entirely name. "How did you hear about that?" he said. "I was in the pantry this afternoon," she said. The window was open. He closed his eyes briefly. "Dell," he said. He wasn't saying anything that wasn't already available to people if they were paying attention, she said. "How bad is it, Caleb?" He'd used his first name deliberately. She watched him register it. He picked up the coffee. He set it down without drinking. He looked at the papers on his desk, and then at the wall, and then at her. And something in his face did what it did sometimes, the thing where the practiced distance dropped for a moment, and she could see what was actually behind it. "The South grazing contract fell through last spring," he said. "I had counted on that income for 2 of the notes. Without it, I'm looking at a shortfall that." He stopped. He pressed his thumb along the edge of the desk. "It's manageable if the fall cattle prices hold. If they don't, I've got 60 days to find another solution before Hendricks calls the notes." "And if Hendricks is pressured," she said. He looked at her sharply. "Victoria," he said. "She's going to do something," Maggie said. "I don't know what exactly, but she's not going to let this sit." Caleb was quiet for a long moment. He had his arms crossed, the thinking posture, and she waited while he worked through whatever he was working through. He stopped, started again. "Victoria and I have known each other a long time. After Martha died, He stopped again, and she heard the weight in the pause, the way certain names still had mass when they landed. "Martha. She was there. She helped. And I let things drift in a direction I shouldn't have, because it was easier than making a decision." "And then you wrote to the agency," Maggie said. "And then I wrote to the agency," he agreed. "Because a practical problem needed a practical solution," she said. Something crossed his face. "That's what I told myself," he said. She looked at him. He looked back. "She won't stop," he said. "Victoria. She's going to find a way to make this harder for you." "I know," Maggie said. "Doesn't that?" He seemed to be searching for the right word. "Doesn't that bother you?" Maggie thought about this honestly. "It bothers me," she said. "But being bothered and being stopped are different things." He looked at her for a moment with that expression that was becoming familiar, the one where she said something, and he spent a few seconds with it before he could move on. "You're a strange woman, Maggie Holloway," he said. "I've been told," she said. And there it was again, not quite a smile, but something closer than usual, something that lived in the corner of his eyes more than anywhere else. She stood and picked up her cup. "The South grazing contract," she said. "Who took it?" He blinked at the shift. "Burnham's Ranch. They undercut me by $15 a head. Can that relationship be rebuilt?" "Not with Burnham," he said. "He and I have history." "What about his neighbors? The Kendrick property or the Stanton place? Would either of them have grazing needs that the Whitmore land could service?" He stared at her. "I'm not a rancher," she said, "but I know how to look at a problem from the outside. Sometimes that's useful." He was quiet for a long moment. "The Stanton property," he said slowly. "Martin Stanton lost 2/3 of his herd to the winter sickness last year. He's been rebuilding slow. If he brought in cattle for the summer season, he'd need grazing." "And you have it," she said. "He's never dealt directly with the Whitmore Ranch," Caleb said. "We don't have a relationship." "Then someone needs to go start one," she said. Caleb looked at his desk and the papers on it, and then at the woman standing in his office with a coffee cup in her hand, who had just identified a potential financial solution in the course of a conversation she'd initiated, because she overheard his foreman's gossip through a pantry window. He picked up his coffee and drank it, and she could tell he was trying to determine which category this woman fit into. And she could also tell that he did not have a category that worked. "I'll ride out to Stanton's tomorrow," he said. "Good," she said. "Good night, Caleb." She walked back down the hall. She set her cup in the kitchen and stood for a moment in the quiet dark, and she heard something that might have been the scrape of his chair in the office. The sound of a man settling in to think about something he hadn't expected to be thinking about. She went to bed and slept better than she had since she arrived. The next day unfolded with the particular speed of days when something important is happening just outside of view. Caleb rode out early before breakfast, which was unusual enough that Thomas Reed noticed and asked Maggie about it when he came in. She said she didn't know, which was technically true since she hadn't told anyone about the conversation. And Thomas looked at her with his 22-year on this ranch eyes, and accepted this with the skepticism of a man who knew she probably knew more than she was saying, but respected her enough not to push. She was in the middle of the afternoon baking when Victoria Langley came back. This time she didn't bother with the pretense of coming to see Caleb. She knocked on the door, and when Maggie opened it, she said, "I'd like to speak with you, if you don't mind." Maggie stepped back and let her in. They went to the kitchen, because Maggie had learned that she had the advantage in the kitchen. Victoria sat at the table and watched Maggie return to the bread she'd been working on, and the dynamic of it, Victoria seated, having to look up, while Maggie moved around her own domain, was not accidental, and both women knew it. "I'm going to be direct with you," Victoria said. "I prefer that," Maggie said. "Caleb is in a difficult financial position," Victoria said. "You may or may not be aware of that." "I'm aware," Maggie said. Victoria paused. That was clearly not what she'd expected. "Then you understand that an additional household expense." "I'm not an expense," Maggie said. "Just accurate." Victoria blinked. "I beg your pardon? I manage the kitchen and the household for this ranch," Maggie said, punching the bread with the calm focus of a woman who has found an excellent use for her feelings. "The food costs for 12 men have decreased by 30% since I arrived because I'm managing inventory instead of wasting it. The men are working better because they're eating better. Ask Thomas Reed what last fall's output looked like compared to what it's tracking toward now." She didn't look at Victoria. She worked the dough. "I'm not an expense, Mrs. Langley. I'm an investment, and I have a better return than your friendship with Walter Hendricks." The silence in the kitchen was absolute. Victoria sat very still. "How do you know about Walter Hendricks?" she said. "I have a pantry window," Maggie said. Another silence, different in quality from the first. Victoria was reassessing visibly, the kind of reassessment that happens when you go into something expecting an easy target and discover the target is looking back at you with equal clarity. "You're not what I expected," Victoria said. "You mentioned that before," Maggie said. "I meant it differently this time," Victoria said. Maggie finally looked at her. Victoria Langley was a woman who had spent 4 years being certain of something that had just become considerably less certain. And the experience was visible on her face in a way that was almost sympathetic if you looked past the previous 2 conversations and the conversation about the banker. "Mrs. Langley," Maggie said, "I understand what you wanted. I understand how long you've been waiting for it. I'm not going to pretend that your position doesn't have its own kind of grief in it." She turned back to the bread. "But I'm here, and I'm staying. Not because Caleb Scrade chose me over you in any romantic sense. He chose a practical solution to a practical problem, and I am that. But I have also become something else to this place, and I think you know that, which is why you're here a second time." Victoria said nothing for a long moment. "He likes you," she said finally. The word seemed to cost her something. "He likes that someone is taking care of things," Maggie said. "Which is not the same thing." Victoria looked at her with an expression that said she was not entirely sure it was different. She left, again without the second cup of coffee that Maggie did not offer. Caleb came back from the Stanton property at dusk, and Maggie knew from the way he came through the door that it had gone well. There was something different in how he moved, a fraction less of the weight he'd been carrying. And she had learned his body language the way you learn the weather in a place you've decided to live, not from studying it, but from being present in it long enough that you simply know what the signs mean. He came to the kitchen. He poured himself coffee. He sat at the table and she put a plate in front of him because he hadn't eaten since morning, and he ate and didn't speak until half the plate was gone. Stanton's interested, he said. Good, she said. He wants to bring 30 head out for the summer season. We'll negotiate the rate next week when he comes to look at the north pasture. Good, she said again. He looked up at her. How'd you know? Know what? That Stanton would be a fit. That he'd be interested. That it was he stopped. You've been here a month. You don't know this country, or these people. I don't need to know the country, she said. I needed to know the shape of the problem. The problem was a gap in the income. The solution was someone who had a gap in the resources. The geography was yours to navigate. He looked at her for a long time. Victoria came today, Maggie said. He set his fork down. What did she say? We had a conversation, Maggie said. I think it went about as well as it could, Maggie. I handled it, she said. You don't need to worry about it. He looked like a man who wanted to argue with that and couldn't quite find the grounds. You shouldn't have to handle it, he said. A lot of things shouldn't be the way they are, she said. That doesn't change what needs doing. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at his plate, he looked at his hands, he looked at her. Why are you, he started and then stopped. Why am I what? Why are you doing all of this, he said. The pantry. The cost tracking. The Stanton idea. Why does it matter to you? This was supposed to be you came here for a place to live. You don't have to. Caleb, she said. He stopped. She sat down across from him, which she did not usually do while he was eating, and she looked at him directly. When I stepped off that train, I saw 12 men who had forgotten what it felt like for someone to give a damn whether they ate. I saw a ranch that was dying from the inside because nobody was tending to the people. And I saw you. She held his gaze, a man that got heavier every day because he'd decided a long time ago that he had to carry it alone. He was very still. This place needed care, she said. I know how to give care. That's not complicated. It's not nothing either, he said. His voice was different. No, she said. It's not nothing. They sat in the kitchen in the lamplight for a moment that was different in quality from any moment that had come before it, not because anything dramatic had happened, not because anything had been declared or promised, but because something had been said plainly that had been building for a month, and the air in the room was different for it. Then Eli's voice came from the doorway. Ma'am, my wrist feels a lot better. Do you think I stood? The moment reorganized itself. Let me look at it, she said. She crossed to Eli and took his hand and examined the wrist, and Caleb watched her do it, watched the focused care of it, the way she pressed and asked and listened to the answer. The way Eli trusted her with the information of where it hurt, and something in his face went somewhere private that nobody could see because Maggie's back was to him, and Eli was looking at his wrist. Better, she said to Eli. You can try light work tomorrow. Nothing that puts full pressure on it for at least 3 more days. Come to me if it swells again, Eli said. He left. Maggie turned back to the table and began clearing Caleb's plate, and he stood and brought his cup to the counter. And for a moment they were both in the same small space of the kitchen doing ordinary things, and the ordinary was layered over something that was not ordinary at all, and both of them knew it. Good night, he said. Good night, she said. He walked down the hall. She stood in the kitchen and finished the dishes, and told herself several sensible things about practical arrangements, and the wisdom of not making more of things than they were. She believed approximately half of them. 3 days later, The thing she had been waiting for arrived, because the thing you brace for rarely fails to show up. And Victoria Langley had not become a woman of influence in Harlow Creek by abandoning a plan simply because an obstacle proved more substantial than expected. What she did was change tactics. On a Tuesday morning, a buggy arrived at the Whitmore Ranch, carrying not Victoria but a woman named Harriet Clough, who was the wife of the county land commissioner, and therefore someone whose opinion carried institutional weight in a way that Victoria's personal feelings did not. She was 60, stout, severe in the way of women who have confused rigor with righteousness, and she arrived with the air of someone performing an official function. She asked to see the kitchen. Maggie was not warned. She was in the middle of the morning cleanup when Harriet Clough came through the door behind Thomas Reed, who was wearing an expression that was the face of a man caught between loyalty and bewilderment. "Mrs. Whitmore," Harriet said, looking at Maggie with the comprehensive assessment of a woman who is about to render judgment and has already decided what it is. "Miss Holloway," Maggie said, because she still said this, still held on to that small accuracy. "Can I help you, ma'am? I've been asked to make an informal assessment of the domestic arrangements here," Harriet said. "Given the circumstances of the arrangement and certain concerns that have been raised regarding the suitability." "Whose concerns?" Thomas Reed said from behind her. Harriet turned to look at him. Thomas Reed did not like a man asking a casual question. "Several members of the community have Victoria Langley is not the community," Thomas said. Harriet drew herself up.
"Mr. Reed seeks after this concern."
"I've worked this ranch for 22 years, Thomas said. "And I'm telling you that the woman standing at that stove has done more for this place in 6 weeks than the 3 years before her combined. So if someone sent you out here to find fault, you can tell them from me that you didn't find any." The kitchen was completely silent. Maggie stood at the stove and did not move. Harriet Clough looked at Thomas Reed, and then she looked at Maggie, and she seemed to be recalibrating something. She was a woman who had come in with a purpose, and found that the room she'd walked into had a different shape than the one she'd been told to expect. She looked around the kitchen. She looked at the organized pantry, the repaired stove, the clean surfaces, the inventory sheet pinned to the cabinet, the row of covered dishes waiting for the midday meal. She looked at Eli Parker, who had come in with the water bucket and was now frozen in the doorway. What was happening with his 17-year-old face an open book of outrage. "How many men do you cook for?" Harriet said, and her voice had shifted, something in it less prepared. 12, Maggie said. 3 meals a day. And the household management? "I handle the accounts, the supply orders, the scheduling of domestic maintenance, and the medical needs of the hands when they arise," Maggie said, steady and even. "I can show you the account books if you'd like." Harriet blinked. "You keep account books?" "I do." Another silence. Harriet Clough was 60 years old, and had spent those 60 years developing an accurate read of people and situations, and what she was reading in this kitchen was running directly counter to what she'd been told to expect. She had been told to expect disorder and inadequacy. She had found the opposite, defended by a ranch hand who had 22 years of standing to put behind his assessment. "That won't be necessary," Harriet said finally. She turned and walked back out through the door. Thomas Reed waited until the buggy was moving down the road before he turned to Maggie. His face had done something she hadn't seen it do before. It had gone soft around the edges. He put his hat back on his head and looked at her with the expression of a man who has made a decision that took a while to make. "You belong here," he said. "I should have said it sooner." Maggie looked at him for a moment. "Thank you, Thomas," she said. He nodded once. He picked up his hat and walked back out. Eli Parker put the water bucket down with a thud and said, "That old woman had some nerve. Coming out here like that." With the passionate indignation of someone who has just realized that fairness is not automatic, that it has to be fought for. "Language," Maggie said, but she was already turning back to the stove. "Yes, ma'am," Eli said, not sounding remotely sorry. She stood at the stove with her back to the room and let the moment pass through her. Thomas Reed's voice saying, "You belong here," and the shape of what that caused him to say, and the way it landed in her chest like something she had been waiting to hear, without fully knowing she was waiting. She stood there and breathed and felt it settle. Then she lifted the lid on the midday pot and checked the progress of the stew. When Caleb came in at noon, Thomas Reed told him what had happened before Maggie had the chance to decide whether to mention it. And Caleb stood in the doorway of the kitchen with a look on his face that moved through several phases, quickly confusion, understanding, anger, and something that arrived last and stayed. He looked at Maggie. "Are you all right?" he said. "I'm fine," she said. "Victoria sent someone official." "I know what Victoria did," Maggie said, "and Thomas handled it before I had to." Caleb looked at Thomas, who was sitting at the table with his coffee and his 22-year face. "You didn't have to start it, didn't I?" Thomas said. He looked at Caleb in the direct way that very old loyalty allows. "You brought this woman here, and half this county has been deciding she doesn't deserve to be here since before they knew her name. Someone ought to say something." He picked up his coffee. "I said something." Caleb stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at Maggie. She looked back at him. "I'm going to talk to Walter Hendricks," he said. "Caleb, Victoria used him as a threat," he said. "I'm not going to let that stand. I'll go today." "You don't have to fight this," Maggie said. "I know I don't have to," he said. She looked at him. He was looking at her the way he'd looked at her the night he said she fit. The same quality of surprise at his own sincerity. The same refusal to take it back. "Eat first," she said. He sat down. She put a plate in front of him and went back to the stove, and the kitchen held all of them, Caleb and Thomas and Eli and Frank, who had come in quietly and sat at his usual place and was eating lunch with them and a match with a contentment watching that was worth watching. And outside the window the summer afternoon moved on in the way that days move when something is changing in the middle of them, in the slow and irreversible way of things that have finally been set into motion. Caleb rode into Harlow Creek that same afternoon and was back before supper, and Maggie knew from the set of his jaw when he walked through the door that the conversation with Walter Hendricks had not gone the way he intended. He came straight to the kitchen. He poured himself water from the pitcher, not coffee, which told her the ride had been long and the meeting longer. He stood at the counter and drank, and she waited, because she had learned that Caleb Whitmore said things when he was ready to say them and not a moment before, and pushing made him go in the other direction. "Hendricks already knows," Caleb said. Maggie stopped stirring. "Knows what? About the Stanton arrangement? About the reduced supply costs? About the—" He set the cup down. "Someone talked to him before I got there. Someone laid out the numbers. Not the problems, the improvements." She looked at him. "He told me the notes aren't a concern," Caleb said. His words. Not a concern. 2 weeks ago they were the thing keeping me awake at 3 in the morning, and today Hendricks told me he sees no reason to call them early given the trajectory of the ranch's operations. He turned and looked at her fully. "You talked to him?" "I wrote him a letter," Maggie said. "Last week," she said. "I sent it with the supply wagon on Thursday. I laid out the cost reductions and the projected income from the Stanton grazing contract and what the fall cattle numbers would likely look like if the men kept eating and sleeping properly and had something worth working for." She held his gaze. "I told him the ranch wasn't failing, it had been starving, and that the starvation had been fixed." The silence between them had a specific quality. Not anger. Something that took longer to identify. "You wrote to my banker," he said. "I protected what needed protecting," she said. "I should have told you before I sent it. I'm sorry for that part." He looked at her for a long time. "You're not sorry for sending it," he said. "No," she said. Another long silence. Then something moved through his expression, that shift she was coming to recognize, where the man who carried everything alone ran up against the reality that someone had carried something for him without being asked. And he didn't have a pre-built reaction for that. Next time he said, "Tell me first." "All right," she said, And then do it anyway if you think it needs doing, he said. She looked at him. He picked up the water cup and turned back to the counter, and she could see the very edge of something in his profile that was not quite a smile, but was the closest neighbor to it. She turned back to the stove. The summer deepened, and the ranch ran differently. It was not a dramatic transformation. It was the kind of change that happened in accumulations the way water changes a stone, not by single strikes but by consistent patient presence. The men came to meals and stayed longer than was strictly necessary. The conversations at the table grew from exchanges of necessary information into something that occasionally resembled genuine human enjoyment of each other's company. Thomas Reed, who had spent 22 years in the particular loneliness of a man who held himself slightly apart from everyone, had developed the habit of lingering over his coffee after the others filed out. And Maggie had learned that this was when he talked, and she had learned to let him talk without responding too quickly, because Thomas thought in long arcs and needed room. He told her about the ranch the way it had been. About Martha Whitmore, who had been small and sharp-tongued in a way Thomas described with unmistakable affection, who had run the domestic side of the Whitmore operation with an iron competence that Thomas now understood, in retrospect, had been the thing holding the whole structure together. When she died, Thomas said one morning, turning his coffee cup slowly in his hands, Caleb just kept working. Like if he worked hard enough, the hole would fill in on its own. He looked at the cup. It don't work like that. No, Maggie said. It doesn't. He's different since you got here, Thomas said. Don't know if you noticed. I noticed, she said. Thomas looked at her with his 22-year eyes. Good, he said. He finished his coffee and stood and put his hat on and went back to work. What Maggie noticed, specifically and precisely, was this. Caleb had stopped eating alone. In the first weeks after her arrival, he came to the table at odd times, ate quickly, and left before the meal was properly finished, as though he was fulfilling an obligation rather than doing something he wanted to do. Somewhere around the 5th week, that changed. He started coming at the regular time. He started staying. He started being present at the table in the way that presence means something, leaning forward into the conversation, asking questions that were not about ranch operations, laughing occasionally quietly. The contained laugh of a man who was out of practice when Eli said something that was more honest than intended. He also started finding reasons to be in the kitchen. Not always with a purpose. Sometimes just to pour coffee when the pot in his office was cold. Sometimes just to set a repaired hinge on the counter and say, "Here, if you need more of these." Sometimes just to stand in the doorway for a moment on his way through the house, as if checking that the room was still there, that it still sounded and smelled the way it had come to sound and smell. Maggie noticed all of it and filed it carefully away in a part of herself she was not fully examining yet. The day everything broke open came at the end of August, and it came from a direction she had not predicted. She had predicted Victoria. She had predicted the bank. She had predicted the small cruelties of a town making up its mind about a woman it had decided not to welcome. What she had not predicted was Martin Stanton. Martin Stanton was 49 years old, and he had shown up the previous week to negotiate the grazing terms for his 30 head, and Caleb had brought him to the table for the midday meal as a matter of basic rancher hospitality. And Maggie had put food in front of a man she'd never met and watched him eat with the unguarded appreciation of someone who had been running his household without anyone to cook in it since his wife passed 2 winters ago. He was a decent man. She had assessed this in the first 15 minutes and had not changed her assessment. He was also, she had noted with the detachment of someone reading a situation rather than participating in it, a man who was looking at her in a way that was not unpleasant, but was unmistakably particular. She had not thought much of it. She thought about it considerably more when he came back. He came on a Wednesday, which was not a ranch business day, which meant the visit was not about the cattle. He brought a jar of honey from his own bees, which was the kind of thing a man brings when he wants to give a woman something without it, looking like he's giving a woman something. He asked for Caleb and was told Caleb was out on the North Range, and then he accepted the offer of coffee with a promptness that suggested he had been hoping to be offered coffee. Maggie poured his coffee and sat across the table because it was polite to do so, and he thanked her for the meal he'd had the previous week in the particular and specific way of a man who has thought about a meal more than is customary. "I don't know when I last ate like that," he said. "Thank you," she said. He stopped, started again in the way people start again when they hit a word that still has weight. "She was a fine cook. After she passed, I've been managing." "Managing is hard," Maggie said. He looked at her with the directness of a man who had reached an age where he had stopped approaching things sideways. "You've made something here," he said. "In a short time. I could see it just eating one meal." "The men are good men," she said. They needed you," Martin Stanton said. She looked at him. He held her gaze honestly. "I know the situation here," he said. "Mail order arrangement. I'm not suggesting." He paused. "I'm saying that a woman with your skill and your quality shouldn't feel like she's just filling a practical role." Maggie was quiet for a moment. "Mr. Stanton," she said. I'm saying," he said, careful and deliberate, "that if the arrangement here is not what you'd hoped it would be, there are other arrangements that might." She said very quietly, "The arrangement here is what it needs to be." He looked at her. He was a perceptive man. He read something in her face that answered a question he'd actually been asking. He picked up his coffee and drank. "All right," he said. Not hurt, not embarrassed, just a man adjusting his understanding. "I appreciate your consideration," she said, and she meant it, because she did, because there was something in being seen clearly and still thought well of that a person didn't dismiss lightly, whatever the context. He left when the coffee was done. He was halfway to his horse when Maggie heard boots on the porch from the other direction, and she turned to see Caleb coming around the side of the house from the barn. And she understood from the trajectory that he had come in from the range and come to the house from the barn, and therefore had been in view of the kitchen window for at least the last several minutes. He came up the porch steps. He watched Martin Stanton's horse go down the drive. He turned and looked at Maggie with an expression she had not seen before. "What did he want?" Caleb said. "He brought honey," she said. The muscle in Caleb's jaw moved. "He brought honey. And we had coffee. He's a widower," Caleb said. "I know," she said. "He's got a decent property," Caleb said. "Good, manages it well." "I know that, too," she said. Caleb looked at her. She looked at him. The porch between them was not very large. "Did he?" Caleb started. "He was respectful," Maggie said. "He said nothing inappropriate." "But he said something," Caleb said. She held his gaze. He suggested that if the arrangement here wasn't what I'd hoped for, there might be other arrangements worth considering. Caleb went very still. "And what did you tell him?" he said. His voice was carefully flat in the way voices go when someone is being careful on purpose. "I told him the arrangement here is what it needs to be," she said. Something happened to Caleb's face. It moved through something she couldn't fully read from front to back, and then it landed on an expression she had not seen yet, something more open than his usual, something with less architecture around it. "Is it?" he said. She looked at him steadily. "That depends on what it's becoming," she said. The silence was different from all the previous silences. It had a different quality entirely, the quality of something that has been building underneath regular conversation for weeks and has finally found its way to the surface. He took one step toward her, and then Del Purvis came around the corner of the house at a full walk, breathless, and said, "Caleb." "We got a problem." Both of them stepped back from wherever they'd been going. Caleb turned. "What?" The cattle Victoria Langley just had moved, Del said, and he was talking fast, which Del never did, which meant it was serious. Her foreman put 40 head on the creek land, the south section. The boundary marker's been moved. Caleb's entire expression reorganized in the way a man's face reorganizes when something attacks what he's built. "That land is Whitmore land," he said. "The marker says different now," Del said. "Somebody moved it." Caleb looked at Maggie for one moment. She could see exactly what was happening behind his eyes, the financial calculation, the legal implication, the understanding of what this was and who had ordered it and why, and the particular cold fury of a man who had been patient and now had run out of patience. "Get Thomas," he said to Dell. "Get Frank. Get everyone in from the field." Dell went. Caleb turned back to Maggie. His jaw was set and his eyes had gone to that focused place she'd seen when he was solving a problem, but underneath it was something that was not solvable in the same way, something that had to do with the conversation they'd just been interrupted in the middle of. "Go," she said. He looked at her. "Go handle it," she said. "Come back and tell me what happened." He held her gaze for a half-second longer than necessary. Then he went. She stood on the porch and watched him cross the yard at the measured pace of a man going to war by choice, and she understood what Victoria had done. She had waited until her direct approaches had failed, until Harriet Clough had come back empty-handed, and the letter to Hendricks had been neutralized by Maggie's own letter. Until the social pressure and the implied threats had all glanced off a woman who refused to be moved. And then she had gone after the land itself. If the boundary marker held, Caleb lost grazing land. If the grazing land was gone, the Stanton contract was compromised. If the Stanton contract failed, the fall income projections changed. And if the income projections changed, it was a long way around. But it was clever, and Maggie had the cold recognition of someone watching an opponent reveal genuine intelligence in a move that was designed to destroy something she had worked for. She went inside, she went to the kitchen and stood for a moment, and then, because there was nothing to be done about the boundary marker by standing in a kitchen, she started the prep for supper. She had 12 men who were going to come back from whatever happened at the south section either angry or relieved. And either way they would need to eat, and feeding people was the one thing she could do right now that was unambiguously useful. She cooked. She was halfway through the supper preparations when Eli came in, earlier than usual, walking with that specific energy of a boy who has witnessed something and cannot keep it inside him. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, and this time she didn't correct him, because she was focused on the pot and because she noticed, somewhere in a part of herself that catalogued these things, that he'd said it differently than the first time anyone had used it, not as a label but as a name. "What happened?" she said. "Caleb had the original survey map," Eli said, "from when the ranch was filed. He keeps it in the strongbox in the office." Thomas went and got it, and they rode out to the south section and held it up against where the marker was. She said, "The marker was off by 60 feet, Eli said. 60 feet into Whitmore land. Who witnessed the survey map?" "Caleb and Thomas and Dell," Eli said, which surprised her. Dell as a witness, but she didn't comment. "And Victoria's foreman. He came over when they pulled the map out." He looked at it, and Eli paused, and she could tell he was deciding how to characterize what he'd seen. He didn't say anything. He just looked at the marker and then at the map, and then he took his hat off. "That's all. Riding to town," Eli said. "Thomas is with him." She nodded. She turned back to the stove. "Set the table. Set the table." They were quiet for a while, the kitchen busy with the sounds of food being prepared. And then Eli said, without looking up from the silverware, "She's not going to stop, is she?" "Mrs. No," Maggie said. "Probably not for a while." "Why does she hate you so much?" Maggie considered this. "She doesn't hate me," she said. "She hates what I represent." "There's a difference. What does she think you represent?" Maggie stirred the pot. "The end of something she was counting on," she said. "That's a hard thing to accept. It doesn't make her behavior right. But it makes it understandable." Eli thought about this with the serious face he put on when he was actually doing something. "You're nicer about her than she is about you," he said. "That's not niceness," Maggie said. "That's just trying to understand why people do what they do." "It helps." She looked at him. "You're old enough to start doing that. Understanding why people do things, even when what they do is wrong. It makes you harder to surprise." Eli looked at her. "When she moved the marker." "No," Maggie said. "Then why didn't you?" Because knowing something might happen doesn't mean you can stop it from happening, she said. Sometimes you can only be ready when it does. He was quiet again. Then, Caleb was ready, she said. He had the survey map in the strongbox. I didn't put it there. He put it there years ago, because he's a careful man who protects what's his. She paused. I remind him that he was that kind of man. When he'd started to forget, Eli set the last piece of silverware down and stood back and looked at the table he'd set. She noticed he'd set it the way she'd shown him properly, the way it should be done, and the noticing sat warm in her chest. You do that a lot, he said. Remind people of what they already are. She looked at him. He was 17 years old, and he had just said the most accurate thing anyone on this ranch had said about her since she arrived. Set out the water pitcher, she said, because she didn't have words for what the accuracy of it did to her. Not right then. He got the pitcher. Caleb came back after dark. He came alone. Thomas had stopped in town. Something about a conversation with the land commissioner's office that needed to be conducted without Caleb present for reasons of temperament, which Maggie understood immediately. She heard the horse in the door and his boots in the hall, and then he was in the kitchen doorway, and she read the situation in his face before he said a word. It was not over. The marker's going back, he said. He came to the table and sat, and she put a plate in front of him and poured coffee without being asked. The land commissioner's office confirmed the original survey. Victoria's foreman, his name's Regis, good man actually, he admitted the marker had been moved on Mrs. Langley's instruction. He didn't want to say it, but when the commissioner's man laid the survey out and asked him directly, he told the truth. Maggie sat down across from him. Is Reyes all right? Caleb looked at her. He lost his job tonight, he said. Victoria let him go the minute word got back to her that he'd talked. Maggie absorbed this. Where will he go? Caleb was quiet for a moment. He was looking at his plate but not eating yet. That's an interesting question, he said. Thomas says so. Then he needs work, Maggie said. Caleb finally looked up. You think I should offer him a position? I think a man who told the truth when it would have been easier to lie deserves to have that mean something, she said. And I think you have a ranch that can use experienced hands. He looked at her for a long moment. I already thought of it, he said. I wanted to see if you'd think of it too. She looked at him. Are you testing me? Maybe, he said. The corner of his mouth moved. Little bit. Eat your supper, she said. He ate. And while he ate, she told him what Eli had said, about Reyes taking his hat off when he saw the survey map. And Caleb nodded, and said that was a man who knew he'd been put into the wrong, and was saying so with the only language available to him at that moment, and they talked about it the way they had begun talking about things, not formally. Not with the careful distance of two people maintaining an arrangement, but the way people talk, when they have become accustomed to each other's minds. The knock at the back door came at 9 o'clock. It was not a knock Maggie recognized. She went to the door and opened it, and found a woman she had never seen, small and pinched with the cold night air, and holding a shawl around her shoulders with the grip of someone who was trying to hold herself together through the shawl. I'm looking for Caleb Whitmore, she said. Caleb came up behind Maggie. Clara, he said, and his voice changed in a way she'd never heard it change. The woman Clara looked at him and then looked at Maggie with an expression that was complicated in several layers. I need to talk to you, she said to Caleb privately. Maggie stepped back. I'll be in the kitchen, she said. She went to the kitchen. She did not try to hear what was said in the hall, but the house was not large and voices carry what they carry, and she heard enough to understand that Clara was Caleb's sister-in-law, Martha's younger sister, who had remained in the county after Martha's death, and that she had come because she had heard what Victoria Langley was doing, and she was furious. She had no right, Clara was saying, her voice low and tight with a specific kind of anger. The anger of someone who has been watching something happen that they should have spoken against sooner. Martha's land. Martha's house. You built this place together, and that woman is trying to... Is it? Is she done? A pause. Probably not, Caleb said. Then I want to help, Clara said. I knew Walter Hendricks before Victoria did, Clara said. I knew him when he was trying to court Martha, and she told him she'd rather marry a fence post. He's been embarrassed by that for 15 years. And he's never stopped trying to make it up to the family. Her voice was flat with the precision of someone deploying information. He won't move against you. Not if I remind him that the family is watching. Silence, you should have come sooner, Caleb said. Not accusing, just honest. I know, Clara said, I know I should have. Another pause, smaller. Is she the woman you brought? Is she good, Caleb? A silence that lasted long enough for Maggie, in the kitchen, to become aware that she was holding very still. Yes, Caleb said. She's good. Clara came into the kitchen a few minutes later, while Caleb was walking back through the hall, and she stood in the doorway and looked at Maggie the way a woman looks at a woman who is now living in the house where her sister lived. It was a complicated look, layered with grief and assessment, and something protective that had nowhere clean to land. I'm Clara Pierce, she said, Martha's sister. Maggie Holligy said. She did not say Whitmore, because she was aware of the particular delicacy of this moment. Clara came in and sat at the table, and Maggie, who understood the language of kitchens and what people needed in them, put the kettle on without asking. He was lost, Clara said. After Martha. She stopped. She would have hated seeing him like that. She was not a woman who believed in being lost. She would have kicked him back into motion, that's what she would have done. She smiled at something private and sad. She was very small, but she was very fierce. Thomas told me, Maggie said. Clara looked at her. Talk to you about Martha? Some, Maggie said. Enough to understand. Clara studied her with the careful attention of a woman who has loved the people in this house and has a right to ask hard questions about anyone who's come into it. What do you understand, she said. Maggie poured the tea. She set a cup in front of Clara and sat. I understand that this house had a woman in it who made it what it is, she said. And when she was gone, everyone in it was trying to keep going on what she'd left behind, and slowly they were running out. She held Clara's gaze. I'm not her. I'm not trying to be. But I know how to take care of people, and these people needed taken care of. That's what I understood. Clara looked at her for a long moment. He said you were good, she said. I heard, Maggie said. Clara looked at her cup and then back at Maggie. Are you happy here, she said. And the way she said it, quiet, direct, the question of someone who cared about the answer for more than one reason, made Maggie think carefully before she responded. I'm becoming happy here, she said. That's more than I expected when I stepped off the train. Clara nodded slowly. Something in her face settled. Good, she said. That's good. They drank their tea. Caleb came to the kitchen doorway and looked at the two of them sitting at his table in the lamplight, and something in his face went somewhere entirely private and still. I'll ride out in the morning, Clara said to him. I'll visit Walter on my way through town. You don't have to. I know I don't have to, she said in a tone that suggested this was the second time tonight someone had used that phrase on her, and she found it equally unnecessary both times. She stood and looked at Caleb with the look of a woman who had known him since before he had gray at his temples. You found a good one, she said. Caleb said nothing. I'm going to say hello to Thomas before I leave, Clara said. She picked up her shawl and walked down the hall, and her footsteps went toward the back door in the bunkhouse. Caleb stood in the kitchen doorway. Maggie sat at the table with her cup and did not fill the silence with anything, because she had learned that some silences were full enough without adding to them. Clara liked Martha's kitchen, he said finally. She used to sit right there. Maggie looked at the chair. She looked at him. Does that bother you, she said. Me being in it? He came into the kitchen and stood at the counter, and the lamplight was low and the house was quiet around them, all 12 men long since settled in the bunkhouse. And it was just the two of them the way it sometimes was at this hour, when the day had fully run its course, and what remained was the essential shape of things. No, he said, it doesn't bother me, Caleb, she said. He looked at her. Sit down, she said. He sat. She looked at him across the table in the kitchen that she had repaired and organized and worked in for 6 weeks. In the house she had arrived at as an arrangement and had slowly, without planning to, begun to think of as something else. She looked at him with the honesty she had brought to every room she'd ever been in, the honesty that came from a lifetime of being underestimated and deciding that the only answer to that was to be precisely and completely what you were. "That conversation we were having on the porch," she said. "Before, remember," he said. "I think we should finish it," she said. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at his hands on the table. He looked at her. And then Caleb Whitmore, who had spent 4 years not finishing anything that started with feeling, said, "What Martin Stanton came here to say." "Yes," she said. He wanted to offer me an alternative," she said. He was decent about it, respectful, and I told him no before he finished saying it. "Because the arrangement here is not why I said no," she said. He looked at her. "I said no because I didn't want an alternative," she said. "I want this. I want," she paused, and in the pause was the honest weight of a woman who had not let herself say this out loud even in her own mind. "I want the hooks by the door, and the cracked stove repair, and the wobble in the table that you fixed, because you noticed I'd been working around it for 3 weeks. I want Thomas Reed drinking his coffee too long in the morning, because he wants to talk. I want Eli putting his biscuits on his plate," she held his gaze. "I want you sitting at the end of the table and staying until everyone's gone." The kitchen was very still. Caleb's hands were flat on the table and he was looking at her with the expression she had been watching, develop for 6 weeks, the one that came from underneath everything else, that had been working its way up through the practical and the cautious and the careful for all this time. "I didn't bring you here for this," he said. "I know," she said. "I brought you here because I needed. I know what you thought you needed," she said. "I thought I knew what I needed too. People are usually somewhat wrong about that." He was quiet. The lamp on the table between them was low, and outside the house the Montana night was doing what Montana nights did, enormous and indifferent to everything happening in the small lit kitchen beneath it. "Maggie," he said. He said her name the way he'd said it once or twice before, plain and entirely without performance, just her name in his voice, which was a thing she had been careful not to assign too much meaning to. She stopped being careful. "I know," she said again quietly. He reached across the table. He put his hand over hers, and his hand was large and work-hardened and warm, and she turned her hand over and his fingers closed around hers, and they sat like that in the kitchen that was no longer just a kitchen, at the table in the house that was no longer just an arrangement. And the thing that had been building since the morning, she'd set a plate down so hard the tin rattled, and every man in the room went still. That thing arrived and settled, and was finally, simply, real. Outside, someone had built up the fire in the bunkhouse, and the light of it was visible through the window, and somewhere inside it, 12 men who had started the season as hungry strangers were talking about the day's events with the particular ease of people who had, without fully realizing it, become something they hadn't been for a long time. A crew, a household, something that felt like it mattered. It was Thomas Reed who said it first, because Thomas Reed was a man who said true things when he was finally sure of them, and he had been sure of this one for long enough. "She changed this place," he said. "Not to anyone in particular. Just said it into the room the way you say a thing that is simply plainly true." Nobody argued. Del Purvis, who was sitting on his bunk at the far end of the room, and who had never in his life offered anything resembling an honest concession in another person's favor, turned his hat in his hands and said nothing. Which was the most agreement anyone in that room had ever heard from him on the subject of Maggie Holloway. Frank Guthrie, from his bunk, said, "Yep." Eli Parker said, "She told me something today." He was quiet for a moment. She said, "Understanding why people do things makes you harder to surprise." He thought about this. "I think she was really talking about herself." Thomas looked at him. "She knew Victoria was going to move that marker," Eli said. "She didn't say so. But she knew, and she wasn't surprised when it happened." Thomas turned his coffee cup. "No," he said, "I don't suppose she was." The fire crackled. Outside, that moved across the Montana dark. In the main house, in the kitchen, Caleb Whitmore sat across from his wife with her hand in his and said, eventually, the thing he had been working up to for 6 weeks. "I'm glad you stepped off that train," he said. Maggie looked at him. "So am I," she said. That was everything. The morning after Caleb held her hand across the kitchen table, everything was the same and nothing was the same. And Maggie understood that this was precisely how the most important changes in a person's life always arrived, not with fanfare. Not with a clean, dramatic break from what came before, but with the particular quiet of a door that has been unlocked and now swings open with the lightest push. She was at the stove at 4 in the morning, same as always. The fire started the same way. The coffee went on the same way. Her hands moved through the familiar motions of the morning preparation with the same competence they always brought to it. But somewhere in the space between the coffee and the biscuits, she caught herself doing something she rarely did in other people's presence and almost never did in her own. She was smiling. Not a performance, not the polite upturn she offered when someone said something that deserved acknowledgement. The real kind. The kind that starts somewhere in the chest and arrives on the face without asking permission. She made herself stop. Then she started again without meaning to. Then she gave up and let it do what it was doing while she rolled biscuit dough, because there was nobody in the kitchen to see it, and a woman was allowed a private moment with her own feelings every now and then. Caleb came down earlier than usual. He stopped in the kitchen doorway at 5:15, which was 45 minutes before breakfast and a full hour before he typically appeared, and he had clearly taken some care with his appearance, his hair combed. His shirt the good one and not the work one, which she noticed and did not comment on because she was kind. "Morning," he said. "Morning," she said. He poured himself coffee. He leaned against the counter with the cup and looked at her working, and she could feel the looking in the specific way you feel it when someone is watching you with a kind of attention that is new. "Sleep all right," he said. "Fine," she said. "You?" "Fine," he said. It was not the most articulate conversation two people had ever had the morning after deciding they meant something to each other, but it was honest, and honest was what they both knew how to do. He stood there while she worked, and she let him stand there, and the kitchen held both of them in its early morning quiet, and that was enough. Thomas Reed came in at 6 and looked at the two of them, and looked at his coffee and sat down without saying a word, but something in the set of his shoulders said he had noticed. And something in the particular way he poured his coffee said he was satisfied about it, and that was Thomas Reed's version of a celebration. The men came in was eaten. The day began. What had changed was both invisible and total. Clara came through town as promised and paid her visit to Walter Hendricks. And the following Monday, a letter arrived at the ranch in the land commissioner's official envelope confirming that the boundary of the south section had been formally resurveyed and documented in the county record at its original coordinates. The matter was, in the dry language of official correspondence, considered closed. Caleb read the letter at the kitchen table with his coffee and folded it and put it in his chest pocket and said, "Clara works fast." "She loved your wife," Maggie said. "She did," he said. "Then, she likes you." "I like her," Maggie said. "She doesn't like many people," he said. "Takes after Martha that way." Maggie looked at him. He was looking at his coffee, but he was almost smiling, and she understood that saying Martha's name in this kitchen, in this way, with this expression, was something new. Something that had moved from a closed door to an open one. She did not make more of it than it was, but she noticed. "Finish your coffee," she said. "You've got the Stanton cattle coming Thursday." He looked up. "I know when the cattle are coming." "I know you know," she said. "I'm reminding you because when you're thinking about other things you sometimes forget that Thursday comes after Wednesday and Wednesday is tomorrow." He looked at her with an expression that was trying to decide if it was offended and failing. "I don't forget what day it is. Last week you were late to the supply meeting because you were fixing the fence hinge you'd been meaning to fix for 2 weeks, she said. On a Tuesday that you had called the meeting for. He opened his mouth. He closed it. "Finish your coffee," she said again. He finished his coffee and went to work, and she stood in the kitchen, feeling something warm settle all through her that was not entirely about winning an argument. The Stanton cattle arrived Thursday as planned, 30 head of good stock, and Martin Stanton came with them and was professional and direct and treated Maggie with the precise courtesy of a man who understood where the ground was and was not going to pretend it was somewhere else. She respected him for it. She made sure he ate well at the midday meal and sent him back to his property with 2 jars of blackberry preserves she'd put up the previous weekend. And he took them with a gracious nod, and that was the full extent of what that was, and all 3 people involved understood it. Caleb watched him go from the barn door. When he came into the kitchen at supper, he said, "Stanton's a decent man." "Good ranch," he said. "So I hear." He was quiet for a moment. "He'll find someone," Caleb said. "Not to her, really." "Probably," Maggie said. "People usually do when they stop looking in the wrong direction." Caleb looked at her. She put a plate in front of him and went back to the stove. September came in with the first real edge of cold in the mornings, and the ranch shifted in the way ranches shift with the seasons: more urgency in the work, more focus. The particular tempo of people who know that what gets done now determines what survives the winter. The men worked longer days, and Maggie adjusted accordingly. Heavier meals, more at breakfast, coffee kept hot all day, something warm and filling ready when the men came in at whatever hour the work released them. She had started a second account book. The first one tracked household expenses. The second one was something she hadn't mentioned to Caleb, yet a tracking of the ranch's domestic output, the eggs from the expanded hen flock she'd quietly doubled, the preserves she'd been putting up through the summer, with the extra fruit from the kitchen garden she'd replanted in May, the dried herbs she'd been collecting and drying in bundles in the pantry. It wasn't a large thing, but it was hers and it was growing, and she was building towards something she hadn't fully formed into words yet. She showed it to Caleb on a Sunday evening when the house was quiet. She set the book on the desk in front of him. He looked at the first page and then looked at her. "What is this?" he said. "The kitchen's productive capacity," she said. "Beyond meals. The preserves alone would cover about 15% of the spring supply costs if we sold what we don't use. The eggs are at a consistent surplus. The herb drying." "You've been running a secondary operation," he said. "A small one," she said. "I wanted to be sure it was worth mentioning before I mentioned it." He looked at the second page, the third. He turned pages slowly, and she watched him absorb the numbers and what they represented. She watched him understand that the woman he'd brought to his ranch to cook 3 meals a day had been quietly building something additional in the margins of what she'd already built, and that this additional thing was sound and documented and profitable. He sat back. He looked at her. "How long have you been doing this?" he said. "Since the 3rd week," she said. "You've been keeping a second set of books for 4 months without telling me." "I told you when I knew it was worth telling," she said. He was quiet in the way of a man deciding which response to have. "Then what do you need to expand it?" She sat down. She had a list. She took it out. They talked for 2 hours. What Maggie did not know was that on the other side of Harlow Creek, in the large house that Victoria Langley maintained, with the careful attention of a woman whose house was a statement of what she believed she deserved, something had shifted. It had shifted quietly, the way shifts in proud people always do, not announced, not admitted directly, but visible to anyone watching in the right way. Victoria had stopped making moves. The boundary marker incident had not ended the way she'd planned, and Harriet Clough had come back from the Whitmore Ranch with a report that was the opposite of what Victoria had sent her to find. And Clara Pierce's visit to Walter Hendricks had effectively sealed the financial front. One by one the approaches had closed, but it wasn't the failure of the strategies that changed Victoria. It was something Harriet Clough said, almost in passing, on her way out the door after reporting back. She had said the man looked at her the way Jonah used to look at me, before he took sick. Harriet's husband had been dead for 8 years. She said it without planning to, and it landed in the room and she left and Victoria sat with it for a long time. The way Jonah used to look at me. Victoria was not a stupid woman. She was a woman who had spent 4 years building a case around what she believed she deserved, and had not paused long enough to honestly ask herself whether what she deserved and what she wanted were actually the same thing. Caleb Whitmore was a good man. He was steady and honest, and he had been kind to her in his contained way in the years since Martha. But he had never looked at her that way, not once. She sat in her house for 3 days, and then she did the thing that cost her the most, which was not the thing that looks most dramatic from the outside, but is always the hardest from the inside. She let go. Not with a speech, not with a formal announcement. Just a quiet internal releasing of a grip she'd held for 4 years, and the exhaustion that came after it, and then a small and unexpected lightness she hadn't felt in a long time. She sent a note to Walter Hendricks. She told him to remove any informal conditions she had placed on conversations regarding Whitmore Ranch accounts. She sent it without drama, in her precise handwriting, with the seal she used for her routine correspondence, and she did not explain herself. Hendricks, who had been navigating this situation with the nervous energy of a man caught between two forces he didn't understand, received the note and felt the particular relief of someone who has been holding a door shut and has finally been told he can let go. Maggie never knew Victoria sent that note. Not that week. Not for some time. What she knew was that on a Wednesday morning in mid-September, Thomas Reed came into the kitchen before breakfast, with an expression she had never seen on his face, and she knew immediately that something had happened. "Sit down," he said. Maggie turned from the stove. "Thomas, sit down, Maggie," she sat. He sat across from her. He put his hands on the table. He had the posture of a man about to say something he has rehearsed and is still not sure he can get through. "I got a letter yesterday," he said, "from my daughter in Billings." She had not known. Thomas had a daughter. He had never mentioned family. She waited. "She's been sick," Thomas said. "The whole winter past. She didn't write about it because she didn't want." He stopped. His jaw moved. "She's got 3 children. Her husband's doing what he can, but he's not." He stopped again. "She needs someone to come." Maggie looked at him. "I've been here 22 years, Thomas said. He said it like a man reading an inventory of his own life and finding the numbers surprising. I don't have money put by the way I should. I've got the pay Caleb's given me, and I've got enough for the stage to Billings and maybe 2 months, helping my daughter get back on her feet, but after that." "Thomas," Maggie said. "I'm not asking for anything," he said quickly. I'm not asking, Thomas," she said again firmly. "Stop." He stopped. "When do you need to leave?" she said. He looked at her. His eyes were doing something she had not seen them do. "I don't know if I should. When does your daughter need you there?" He was quiet. "As soon as I can get there," he said. "Then you should go this week," she said. "The fall work." "The fall work will get done," she said. "We'll manage." "Caleb? Let me talk to Caleb," she said. He looked at her for a long moment, and Thomas Reed was a man who had spent his life holding himself at a careful professional distance from the people around him, who had decided somewhere early that needing things was a vulnerability he couldn't afford. And what he was sitting across from right now was a woman who had simply, efficiently, removed the possibility of that distance mattering. His eyes were very bright. "She's my only girl," he said. "I know," Maggie said, though she hadn't known until 3 minutes ago. "You go to your girl. She talked to Caleb at noon." She told him what Thomas had told her, and he was quiet for a moment, and then he stood and went to find Thomas, and she stayed in the kitchen and heard them talking in the hall. The low back and forth of 2 men who had worked beside each other for 22 years and had never once said directly what the other meant to him, now being forced to navigate something adjacent to exactly that. She heard Caleb say, "You take what you need from this month's pay and next." She heard Thomas say, "I can't. You've been here 22 years, Caleb said." "Take it." A pause. "I'll come back when she's steady," Thomas said. "I know you will," Caleb said. Another pause, shorter. "You got a good woman," Thomas said. A beat of silence. I know, Caleb said. Thomas left on Friday with his pay and a satchel Maggie had packed with enough food for the stage journey, and 2 jars of the preserves she'd been putting up, and when he climbed up and looked down from the stage platform, she was standing in the road below, and he looked at her for a long moment. You'll be all right, he said. We'll be all right, she said. He nodded once. The stage moved. She watched it go until it rounded the bend. When she turned back to the wagon, Eli was sitting in it with his arms crossed and his 17-year-old face doing something complicated between trying to look unaffected and not quite managing it. He's coming back, she said. I know, Eli said. He would have stayed if I'd let him, she said. Eli looked at her. Why didn't you let him? Because he needed to go more than we needed him here, she said. Get up. We've got supply stores to finish before the cold really comes in. Eli got up. The 2 weeks after Thomas left were the most demanding Maggie had faced since her arrival. The fall workload was at its peak. The Stanton cattle were on the north pasture and needed management. The supply stores needed to be complete before the first hard freeze. And she was running the kitchen without Thomas's quiet, steadying presence at the table and at the margins of things. She absorbed it. She restructured the morning routine, pulling Eli more formally into kitchen support, identifying which of the other men had untapped capabilities and putting them to use without making it feel like assignment. Frank Guthrie, it turned out, was an efficient and reliable source of firewood once you told him exactly how much was needed and when. Del Purvis, stripped of an audience for his commentary, proved able to carry water and move supply boxes without complaint, perhaps because there was nobody around to perform for. She managed. What she had not managed to fully resolve was the question of the second account book, and what she was going to do with what it represented. It represented, at its core, the fact that Maggie Holloway had arrived on this ranch as a mail-order bride in a practical arrangement and had, over the course of 4 months, built something inside that arrangement that was genuinely her own. The kitchen production she'd documented, the management systems she'd implemented, the accounts she kept. None of it had been in the original terms of what she'd come here to do. All of it was hers. She sat with this for several evenings. She sat with the question of what a woman in her position was entitled to claim as her own. What belonged to her and what belonged to the arrangement. What she'd built and what she'd been given the space to build, and whether those were different things or the same thing. She was sitting with this on a Thursday evening when Caleb came into the kitchen and sat across from her and looked at the second account book she'd been reviewing and said, "Can I see that again?" She handed it to him. He looked through it, not quickly, the way he'd looked the first time, but carefully, the way he looked at things that required actual thought. He went through every page. He looked at the production figures, the cost projections, the estimated revenue from expanded sales. He closed the book. "This is yours," he said. She looked at him. "The work you've done here, the kitchen, the accounts." He put his hand on the book. "This is yours. It came from you. I want you to know I understand that." She was quiet for a moment. "What are you saying, Caleb?" she said. He looked at her with the expression she had learned to read, the one that meant he had decided to say something honest and was going to say it regardless of how it sat. "I want to put your name on the operation," he said. "Not just as my wife. In the accounts, in the ranch record. The household production side is yours, and it should be documented as yours." She looked at him for a long time. "That's not a small thing," she said. "I know it's not," he said. "You've been thinking about this." "Since you showed me the book," he said. "Maybe before that." She looked at the book between them on the table. She thought about the woman who had stepped off the train with a suitcase and a recipe box, who had been assessed in 2 seconds by a crowd of strangers and found lacking, who had walked into a broken kitchen and decided it was going to be something better. She thought about what it meant to have that work recognized not as service but as ownership. Not as contribution but as stake. "Yes," she said. He looked at her. "Yes," she said again. "All right." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. And it was the same gesture as the night in the kitchen when everything had shifted, and she turned her hand over the same way, and this time neither of them was interrupted. There's something else, he said. She waited. I want to have the marriage properly recorded, he said. In the county register, with your full name. It should already be recorded, she said. It was filed as a domestic arrangement, he said. Which is what I told the registrar when we came in, because that's what I believed it was at the time. He held her gaze. I want it recorded as a marriage, because that's what it is. She looked at him. Margaret Holloway Whitmore, he said. That's what I want in the record. She felt something move through her that was too large and too specific to name. It was not surprise. She had felt this coming the way you feel whether not the exact shape of it, but the pressure of it building. It was something else. Something that had to do with a woman who had been told her whole life that she was too much in some ways and not enough in others. Sitting in a kitchen, she had repaired and organized and made into something. Across from a man who was looking at her with the expression of someone who had finally understood the full dimensions of what he was looking at. All right, her voice was even, her hand was steady in his. We'll go to the registrar on Monday, he said. Monday, she agreed. He stood. He was still holding her hand and he didn't let go immediately. He looked at her from the standing position for a moment in the way of a man who has more to say and is rationing himself. And she looked back at him with the patience of a woman who had learned that his time was different from other people's time and that waiting for it was worth it. Good night, Maggie, he said. Good night, she said. He let go of her hand and went down the hall. She sat in the kitchen for a long moment. Then she opened the second account book and wrote at the top of the first page, very neatly, in her careful handwriting, Whitmore Ranch Domestic Operations M. H. Whitmore, proprietor. She looked at it for a moment. Then she closed the book and went to bed and slept better than she had in weeks. The Monday trip to the registrar went without incident, which was in some ways the most remarkable thing about it, given what the previous months had held. Caleb drove the wagon, Maggie sat beside him. They went into the county office together, and the clerk, a young man named Prescott, who was new enough to his position that he had not accumulated all the local gossip yet, registered the marriage in the county record under the names Caleb James Whitmore and Margaret Ann Holloway, with a date and two witnesses, Eli Parker, who had come along under the pretense of needing to collect a package from the freight office, and Frank Guthrie, who had come along for reasons he did not specify and which nobody questioned. The clerk gave them the certificate, and Caleb signed it, and Maggie signed it, and they came back out into the September air, and Eli, who had been waiting on the wagon with the contained excitement of someone trying not to make too much of something, looked at the certificate Caleb was carrying and said, Is that it? Is it done? It's done, Caleb said. Huh, he looked at Maggie. Congratulations, Mrs. Whitmore. She looked at him. He was grinning, barely contained, 17 years old, and entirely unable to keep the happiness off his face. Thank you, Eli, she said. Frank Guthrie said congratulations in his standard three-word allocation. They drove back to the ranch. What Maggie had not anticipated was what happened when they pulled into the yard. The whole crew was there. Not coincidentally there, not drifting in from various parts of the property deliberately there, standing in the yard in their good shirts, which told her immediately that Eli had been less circumspect about the morning's plans than she'd believed. Del Purvis was in the back, which was the most Del could manage, but he was there. Frank went and stood with the others, which completed the group. Someone had put wildflowers on the porch railing. She did not know who. She had a feeling it was Eli, but she also had a feeling that accusing him of it would embarrass him, so she made note of it privately and said nothing. Caleb looked at the assembled men, and then at Maggie with an expression that was trying to be neutral and not quite getting there. Did you tell them? He said to Eli. I may have mentioned something, Eli said. One of the men, Gus, who never said anything remarkable, started a slow, steady clapping, and after about 2 seconds the others joined, not wild, not theatrical, just honest and sustained. And Maggie stood in the yard in the September air with the certificate of her proper marriage in Caleb's hand eyed her, and 12 men applauding in their good shirts, and she understood that this was what belonging felt like. Not the grand version, Not the romanticized version. The real version. The one that happened in a dirt yard in Montana, with a crew of men in their best clothes on a Monday morning because they wanted to be there. She felt the back of her throat do something she refused to give in to. "Get to work," she said. They laughed. They dispersed. Caleb stood beside her as the yard emptied and said very quietly, "Thank you for not running from any of this." She looked at him. "I never run," she said. "I know," he said. "I know you don't." He went inside with the certificate to file it in the strongbox with the survey map, and Maggie stood on the porch for one moment alone, and she looked at the wildflowers on the railing that she was absolutely certain Eli had put there. And she let herself feel the full weight of the morning without managing it, or reducing it, or translating it into something more practical than it was. Then she went inside and started lunch. The first hard twist of October cold came on a Friday night, and by Saturday morning the ground had the specific feel of a season that was done being negotiated with. Maggie had the kitchen running at full capacity, the stores she'd spent September building, holding the weight of what was now needed. And she moved through the preparations for the winter shift with the same steady competence she brought to everything. It was Del Purvis who broke first, not dramatically, not with confession or grand gesture, because Del Purvis was not built for either. He broke in the way men like Del break sideways, through a small action rather than a large word. He came into the kitchen on a Saturday morning and stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands and waited until she turned and saw him. "Nothing," she said. "No," he said. He turned the hat. "I was my mother used to make something." He stopped. He looked at the hat. "I don't even know what it's called." "She made it in the fall. It smelled like—" He stopped again. He seemed to be having a genuine difficulty, the particular difficulty of a man who has guarded himself so completely that saying anything honest has become physically awkward. "What did it taste like?" Maggie said. He looked up, startled that she'd asked a practical question instead of a sentimental one. "Apple and something warm. Spice, maybe." She put it in a deep dish. "Apple butter cake," Maggie said. He blinked. "Maybe. Did it have a crust or was it soft all the way through?" "Soft," he said. "All through." She turned back to the stove. "Come back at supper," she said. "I'll see what I can do." He stood in the doorway for another moment. "I know I wasn't." He stopped. She kept her eyes on the stove. "I know I wasn't good to you," he said. "At the start." She said nothing for a moment. She let it sit where he'd put it. "Come back at supper," she said. He came back at supper. She put a square of apple butter cake on his plate, and she watched him take the first bite, and she watched his face do something it had never done in her presence. It went completely undefended, just for a second. Just long enough for her to see that underneath Del Purvis and everything he performed, there was a man who had a mother who made something warm in the fall and who missed her. He looked at the plate. He didn't look at her. "Thank you," he said. "You're welcome," she said. He ate the rest in silence. Later, clearing up, Eli came to help her with the dishes and said, "Did Del just say thank you to you?" "Apparently," she said. Eli processed this. "Was it cold outside? Did it feel cold? I feel like something should have frozen over." "Eli," she said. "Yes, ma'am?" "Del Purvis is a man who was never taught how to be kind to people who were different from him," she said. "That doesn't make him good, but it also doesn't make him irredeemable. He's learning." Eli dried a plate. "You think people can really change?" She handed him another. "I think people can grow," she said. "Change is a big word. But grow, yes, if they're in the right conditions." He thought about this. "And you're the right conditions?" "The kitchen is," she said. "The table. The meal. People get honest when they're fed and warm. That's not magic, it's just basic." Eli considered this with the face of someone filing it away. "You should teach," he said. She looked at him. "You know things," he said. "About people. How they work. You should teach them." She handed him the last plate. "Maybe I am," she said. He looked at her, then at the clean kitchen, then back at her. "Yeah," he said. "I think you are. The letter from Thomas Reed arrived on the last Thursday of October, and Maggie read it at the kitchen table before anyone else was up, in the early lamplight that had shifted to the angle of the longer mornings. And the letter was 4 pages in Thomas's careful, slightly formal hand, and what it said was this: his daughter was better. Not well, not yet, but better, and the children were being children in the way that meant the worst had passed. He was going to stay through November to make certain. He would be back in December. He said he had received word, he didn't say from whom, that the ranch was running well. He said he was glad to hear it. He said he had known it would. He said at the end, in the last paragraph that she read twice before folding the letter, I spent 22 years on that ranch telling myself I didn't need anyone and everyone on it was just doing a job. I know better now. I know who made me know better. Tell Caleb he got something right. She folded the letter and put it in her apron pocket and stood at the stove and let the kettle come to a boil and felt the warmth of it through the whole morning. The particular warmth of having done something that mattered for someone who didn't know how to say it mattered until they were far enough away to see the full shape of what they'd been given. Caleb came down at 5:30. She handed him the letter without a word. He read at the counter. He read it the whole way through. He folded it and handed it back. December, he said. December, she agreed. He poured his coffee. He looked at her. You going to be all right until then? I've been all right since July, she said. He looked at the cup. I mean, you don't have to carry everything. She turned and looked at him directly. I know I don't have to, she said. He looked up at the echo of the thing they'd both said to each other in different forms all the way back to the beginning. You know what that means when you say it to me? He said. Yes, she said. Do you know what it means when you say it to me? He was quiet for a moment. It means I see you, he said. That's what I mean when I say you don't have to. It means I see what you're carrying, and I want you to know it doesn't go unnoticed. She looked at him. He looked back. Good, she said. Then we understand each other. The October morning moved on outside, and the ranch woke around them, and the sounds of 12 men starting their day filled the yard beyond the kitchen window. And she turned back to the stove, and he stayed at the counter with his coffee, and the kitchen held them both in its particular warmth. And what settled between them in that ordinary hour was not drama and was not declaration, but was something quieter and more durable than either. It was the thing that makes a house a home, not the wood or the glass or the stove or the land surrounding it. Not even the work that built and rebuilt it, season by season, hand by hand. The thing that makes a house a home is the specific person who stands in it and means it, who looks at the people inside it and decides without condition that their hunger matters, that their weariness matters, that the fact of their presence in the world matters and deserves acknowledgement every single day. Maggie had known this since she was 8 years old, and her mother had taught her that food was care made tangible. She had carried it through every room she'd been told she didn't fit. She had brought it to a broken kitchen in Montana and built it into something that 12 men would defend with the same conviction they'd defend their wages or their honor or their right to a fair day's work. And Caleb Whitmore, who had spent 4 years learning what it meant to lose something irreplaceable, had spent 4 months learning what it meant to find something irreplaceable in a form he hadn't been looking for. He stood at the counter with his coffee and watched her work and did not say any of this out loud, because Caleb was not a man who said things in long arcs. But when she turned from the stove and caught him watching, he didn't look away. He just looked back, and in the kitchen of the Whitmore Ranch, with the October cold settling in and the cattle on the north pasture and Thomas Reed's letter in her apron pocket and 12 men moving through the yard and the wildflowers long since gone from the porch railing, that was everything. Thomas Reed came back on a Tuesday in the first week of December. And Maggie knew he was coming before she heard the wagon because Eli had been watching the road from the barn every 20 minutes since breakfast like a boy waiting for something he was too proud to admit he'd been missing. She had biscuits in the oven and coffee on the stove and a pot of the beef stew she'd first made on Thomas's recommendation going on the back burner. And when she heard the wagon pull into the yard, she stayed at the stove because she understood that Thomas Reed's homecoming needed to belong to the men first. She heard the yard, heard voices, heard Ely's whoop that he would have denied making if anyone accused him of it directly. Heard Caleb's low greeting and Thomas's response, briefer than it needed to be but carrying something in its brevity that a longer speech couldn't have held. She heard boots on the porch. Thomas came through the kitchen door alone, and she turned from the stove and looked at him, and he looked back at her, and he had aged some in the 2 months he'd been gone, not badly, not in a broken way, but in the way that a man ages when he's been carrying something true and heavy for a sustained period. His daughter, the grandchildren, the particular grief of watching someone you love fight something you can't fight for them. He stood in the doorway and looked at the kitchen, the organized pantry and the repaired stove and the second account book on the shelf and the herbs drying in their bundles and the clean table with its 12-place settings already laid for the midday meal. And then he looked at her. Still standing, she agreed. He nodded. He came in and sat at his chair, the one that was his without being designated as such, the way certain things in certain houses become assigned through use and love rather than agreement. And she put a cup of coffee in front of him, and he wrapped both hands around it and drank. "My daughter sends her thanks," he said. "She doesn't know your name. I told her about you, and she said to thank the woman at the ranch, and I said I would." "How is she?" "Better," Thomas said, getting strong. "The children are fine. She's going to be fine." He said it the way people say things they've needed to say out loud for a long time to make them fully real. "She's going to be fine." "Good," Maggie said. He sat with his coffee and she went back to the stove, and the kitchen was the same as it had been before he left, and different in every way that mattered, because the people in it were different, changed by the months between his leaving and his returning, and that was the nature of places built by people rather than just occupied by them. "Caleb told me," Thomas said without preamble, "about the registrar." "The certificate." She stirred the stew. "It was overdue," she said. "Yes," he said. "It was." He drank his coffee. "He's different." "He's the same man," she said. "Just alone," Thomas said. "Yes," she said. Thomas set down his cup. "You know what I thought when I first saw you on that platform," he said. "That first day." "I have a reasonable guess," she said. "I thought—" He stopped. He looked at the cup. "I thought Caleb had made a mistake. That he'd been desperate enough to make a bad decision, and we'd all be paying for it before the month was out." He was quiet a moment. "I was wrong in a way I haven't been wrong about a person in a very long time." She turned and looked at him. Thomas Reed was not a man who said these things. She understood what it cost him and received it accordingly. "You weren't wrong about what you saw," she said. "You were wrong about what it meant." He considered this. "Fair," he said. The men came in for the midday meal, and the table was full again the way it had been all summer and into the fall. And Thomas sat in his chair and ate with the particular contentment of a man who has been away from the right place and has returned to it, and Eli sat beside him and talked too much in the way he did when he was happy. And even Del Purvis managed something approximating good humor, possibly because the apple butter cake was back on the table for the first time since Thomas had been there to see it first made. Caleb sat at the head of the table and ate and watched the room with an expression Maggie had come to know well, the private satisfaction of a man who has stopped bracing himself against good things. December built toward winter with the particular deliberateness of Montana cold, the kind that does not apologize or announce itself but simply arrives and intends to stay. The ranch settled into its winter rhythm, different from the fall urgency, slower in some ways and more interior, the work moving indoors and into the maintenance and planning that the brutal seasons demanded. The men were in the bunkhouse more. The kitchen was in use longer hours. Maggie adding a mid-afternoon warm-up of coffee and whatever she had put by because she had learned that a cold man working through a short December day needed something at 3 in the afternoon, or he stopped being useful at 5. She had learned all of them, every single one. 12 men who had arrived in her awareness as a group had become 12 individuals with specific preferences and specific histories and specific ways of being in the world. and she held this knowledge with the same careful competence she brought to the account books, and the supply lists, and the kitchen operations. She knew that Frank Guthrie's right shoulder gave him trouble in the cold, and that if she put the coffee on the left side of the service table, he didn't have to reach across his body for it. She knew that one of the younger hands, a boy named Pete who had joined in October, got quiet in a particular way when he'd had a hard day, and that a bowl of something warm set in front of him, without comment, worked better than anything she could say. She knew that Del Purvis still sat in the back, but that he had started arriving to meals on time, which for Del Purvis was the equivalent of a formal apology for every unkind thing he'd said in July. She knew all of this because she paid attention, and paying attention was the form her care took, had always taken. Since long before she stepped off a train in Montana, with a suitcase and a recipe box and a crowd of strangers deciding what she was before she'd said a word. The letter arrived on a Wednesday morning in the second week of December, and it was addressed to Maggie in a handwriting she didn't recognize. She opened it at the kitchen table after the breakfast dishes were done, and read it twice, and then sat with it in her hands for a full minute before she did anything else. It was from a woman in Billings named Gris Haverford, who ran a boarding house and had heard from someone who had heard from someone else about the domestic production operation at the Whitmore Ranch. She had heard about the preserves. She wanted to know if there was a supply arrangement possible for the coming season. She was willing to pay a commercial rate. Maggie read the letter a third time. Then she went to the shelf and took down the second account book, the one with her name on the inside cover, and she opened it to the projections page she'd built with Caleb in September. And she looked at the numbers she'd written there with the careful optimism of someone who believed in being ready before the opportunity arrived. The opportunity had arrived. She wrote back to Grace Haverford that afternoon. She told Caleb at supper. He read the letter. He looked at the response she'd already drafted. He looked at her. "You already answered her," he said. "I told her we'd confirm quantities by January," Maggie said. "I didn't commit to anything you'd need to weigh in on." "But you're going to do it," he said. "If you think it makes sense," she said. "The projection," he said. "Yes. Of course, yes." He put the letter down. You drafted the response before you told me about it." "I drafted it before I told you because I wanted to have something concrete to show you rather than just the idea," she said. "There's a difference between coming to you with a proposal and coming to you with a possibility." He looked at her for a moment. "You're running a business," he said. "We're running a business," she said. "The second account book has your name on it, too." "It has yours," Fur said. She met his eyes. "Yes," she said. "It does." Something in his face settled in the way that meant he had arrived somewhere he'd been moving toward. He picked up the letter again and read through her drafted response and made one suggestion about the delivery schedule that was genuinely useful and said so, and she incorporated it. And that was how it was decided that Whitmore Ranch domestic operations would expand into commercial supply in the spring, and it was decided at the kitchen table in December, with two people reading a letter together by lamplight. The Christmas week brought Clara. She arrived on the 23rd with her two boys, 14 and 11, in a wagon loaded with things she'd baked and preserved and brought, because she was the kind of woman who arrived at a family gathering with enough food to stock a regiment. And she came through the kitchen door and looked around and looked at Maggie and said, "Good Lord, you've done something with this room." "I repaired the stove," Maggie said, "and the cabinets." "You repaired the—" Clara looked at the stove. "Martha tried to get Caleb to fix that firebox for 2 years." "I got it done the second day," Maggie said. Clara laughed. It was a real laugh, the unguarded kind, and it sounded like something Maggie suspected Caleb's laugh might have sounded like before grief taught him to keep it shorter. 2 days, Clara said. "Lord." She set her things on the counter and began unpacking them with the efficiency of a woman who was used to sharing kitchen space. "I'm going to be honest with you," she said. "I came at Christmas because Caleb asked. But I also came because I wanted to see what you'd built here." And Maggie said. Clara looked at her steadily. "I see it," she said. "I see what you've done." She paused. "Martha would have liked you." She would have given you a hard time for the first 3 months and then decided she couldn't do without you. That was her way. I've heard from Thomas, Clara said. Mostly Thomas, Maggie agreed. Clara put 2 of her jars on the shelf, aligned them with Maggie's, and looked at the row of them together. We should compare methods, she said. The blackberry preserve. I use a different ratio. I'd like that, Maggie said. And that was how it was with Clara, not dramatic. Not the formal conferring of acceptance that might have happened in a different story, but practical and warm and sideways. The way women who are both competent and particular negotiate each other's preference in a shared space and discover they can occupy it together without friction. Caleb's Christmas gift to Maggie was not wrapped or presented in any formal sense. He told her about it on Christmas morning before anyone else was up, standing in the kitchen while she had the stove going and the kettle on. And what he told her was that he had filed the second account book in the county business registry under her name, which made the domestic operations side a formally documented enterprise, which meant that whatever she built with it was legally and permanently hers in a way that could not be undone by a change in circumstance or a bad season or any external pressure. She stood at the stove and took this in. When did you do that? She said. November, he said. I wanted to be sure the paperwork was complete before I told you. You've been holding that since November, she said. I wanted to get it right first, he said. I wanted there to be nothing tentative about it. She turned from the stove. She looked at him in the kitchen of their house. In the early light of Christmas morning, this man who had written a letter to an agency because his ranch was the failing and his people were hungry, and he didn't know what else to do. This man who had stood on a platform and taken her suitcase without being asked and driven home in silence and given her space to make it into something. This man who had said fit when she needed to hear it. Who had held her hand across a table, who had gone to a registrar and a county business office and filed papers that said her name on them because he understood that a woman who built things deserved to own what she built. She crossed the kitchen and put her arms around him. He was surprised for exactly 1 second she felt it, the small adjustment of a man who had spent years not being reached for, and then he put his arms around her and held on, and neither of them said anything. Because there was nothing that needed saying that the moment wasn't already saying on its own. They stood in the kitchen on Christmas morning until the kettle began to sound, and then she pulled back and went to it, and he stayed at the counter with the expression of a man who had been given more than he'd known to ask for. Merry Christmas, Caleb, she said. Merry Christmas, Maggie, he said. Clara's boys ate so much at Christmas dinner that the 11-year-old had to be carried to the parlor afterward, which made everyone laugh, including Clara and including Caleb, who laughed the full version, not the contained one. And Maggie sat at the table and watched him do it, and felt something in her chest that she had given up guarding against months ago. Thomas Reed made a toast with his coffee cup because he did not drink and never had, and what he said was brief in the way that Thomas said the truest things, just to the ranch, to the people in it, and to the woman who reminded us we were people worth feeding. There was a silence that lasted just long enough. Then Eli Parker, who was crying in the specific way of a 17-year-old who is absolutely not crying, said, "I'm not, it's just the coffee. It's hot." The laughter that followed was the best thing the kitchen had held all year. The turn to the new year brought the first genuine snowfall, and the ranch closed inward the way ranches do in hard winter, self-contained and focused, and turning its attention entirely to the work of surviving the season with everything intact. Maggie had prepared for it the way she prepared for everything, methodically, completely, nothing left to chance that could be arranged in advance. The stores were full. The accounts were in order. The supply correspondence for the spring commercial expansion was drafted and waiting. She had also quietly and without announcement begun teaching. Not in any formal sense, not standing at the front of a room with a lesson plan, but in the way that she had always transferred knowledge sideways, in context, through the doing of things alongside people who needed to learn them. Eli had become her primary student without either of them agreeing to it, absorbing kitchen management and household accounting, and the particular skill of reading what a group of people needed before they knew they needed it. She had started teaching him to keep the secondary account book, explaining the methodology, watching him catch on with the focused speed of someone who had found the thing his particular mind was built for. Pete, the quiet October boy, had turned out to have a facility for the kitchen garden planning that exceeded even Maggie's own. And she had given him the seed catalog for the spring and watched him spend 3 evenings with it, the way she'd spent evenings with her recipe box. Frank Guthrie had started mending things. Not just the things she asked him to fix, things he noticed on his own. The loose board on the porch step, the gap in the door frame that let the cold in, the hinge on the pantry cabinet that had been slightly off for a month. She had said nothing to prompt this. She had only, months ago, fixed the things that needed fixing in front of him and watched him watch her do it. And apparently that had been enough. Del Purvis had started saying please consistently. It was not a small thing. On the last day of January, Maggie sat in Caleb's office, their office, which it had become gradually in the way things become shared, and looked at the winter accounts and the spring projections, and the letter from Grace Haverford confirming the commercial supply arrangement, and the correspondence from 2 additional boarding houses in towns along the stage route that had heard about the Whitmore operation and wanted to discuss terms, and she looked at all of it spread on the desk and felt the full weight of what a year had built. Caleb came in and sat across from her, not at his own side of the desk, but in the chair she usually sat in when she was reviewing his books, which was an inversion they had both become comfortable with. The way the house had rearranged itself around 2 people instead of 1. The Haverford quantity, he said. We need to decide the spring production schedule. I've been thinking about adding 2 more rows to the kitchen garden, she said. The east side gets good light. Pete's already mapped it. Caleb looked at her. You've had Pete planning the garden. He's good at it, she said. Better than me for the spatial logic. I'm better at the variety selection and the preservation timing. We work well together. Caleb sat back, he looked at the papers and then at her. You're building a team, he said. I'm building what the ranch needs, she said. He was quiet a moment. It's more than a kitchen operation, he said. You know that. I know, she said. He paused, organizing something. They work differently than they did a year ago. Not just because they're eating better. They're steadier, more invested. Frank notices things now. Eli's keeping accounts. Pete's planning the garden. He looked at her. What you're doing with them? I'm just paying attention, she said. That's not just anything, he said. He stopped. He had the look he sometimes got when he was trying to say something that required more words than he usually used. That's what makes the difference between a ranch that runs and a ranch that lasts. She looked at him across the desk. This ranch is going to last, she said. Yes, he said. It is. The spring arrived the way springs arrive after hard Montana winters, not gently, not gradually, but with a sudden aggressive return of warmth that felt almost personal after the months of cold, like something that had been withheld and was now making up for it in a rush. The ground thawed. The cattle that had come through the winter in strong condition began to move with the particular energy of animals released back into open space. The Stanton cattle were due again, more of them this time, 35 head instead of 30, because the previous season had gone well, and Martin Stanton was a man who paid attention to what worked. The kitchen garden went in 2 weeks ahead of schedule, because Pete had planned it that efficiently, and the ground was ready, and Maggie had learned not to argue with a good plan. The first shipment to Haverford's boarding house left for the ranch on the second Friday of April in a wagon driven by Gus, who had been chosen partly because he was reliable and partly because the route took him through a town where his brother lived, and she had worked the delivery schedule around giving him the time to stop. She had not mentioned this to Caleb in advance. She had simply built it into the plan. He noticed when he reviewed the route. You routed through Porter Creek, he said. The road is better, she said. He looked at her. She looked back. Gus's brother lives in Porter Creek, he said. Does he? She said. Caleb set down the route sheet. He looked at the desk. He looked at her. He had the expression he got when she did something that showed her in such complete relief that he needed a moment to absorb it. You know, he said, when I wrote that letter to the agency, I told them I needed someone competent. Someone who could manage a household and feed men and keep accounts. I know, she said. I didn't know to ask for. Stopped. He was quiet in the way of a man choosing words carefully. I didn't know to ask for someone who would know to route a supply wagon through Porter Creek. She looked at him. I didn't know that was something a person could be, he said. Someone who holds all of it. Every need. Every stopped again. I didn't know to look for that. You weren't looking for it, she said. You were looking for someone to cook. And now, he said, she held his gaze. Now you have someone who cooks, she said. And everything else. He reached across the desk and took her hand, and she led him, and they sat in the office that was their office with the spring light coming through the window, and the sound of the yard busy with the work of a ranch that was running well. And the gravity of what 1 year had made settled between them with the completeness of something that had always been true and had simply taken time to become visible. Thomas Reed knocked and came in before they separated. Because Thomas had the timing of a man who had been on this ranch long enough to have a feel for its rhythms and had not entirely lost the habit of choosing moments that cut through sentiment before it became something someone would have to apologize for later. He came in with a piece of paper that was the tally from the Stanton cattle count and set it on the desk. 36, he said. He added one. Said the extra was a gift for the good season. Tell Martin Stanton he's welcome at our table whenever he comes through, Maggie said. Thomas looked at her. He looked at Caleb. He looked at the hands that were only just separating. He had the expression of a man who saw everything and had the dignity to see it without comment. Yes, ma'am, he said. He picked up his hat. He went back out. Caleb looked at the doorway he'd left through. He's never going to say anything about any of it, he said. He said everything he needed to, Maggie said. The day he told the Clough woman I belonged here. Caleb looked at her. He said it first, she said. Before you, before anyone. He was right, Caleb said. He usually is, she said. It's annoying. Caleb laughed. The full one. The summer came, and the Whitmore Ranch ran the way a well-managed thing runs, not without difficulty, because nothing real runs without difficulty, but with the confidence of a place that knows its own foundation. The commercial operation expanded to 4 boarding houses along the stage routes. Pete's Garden was the most productive the ranch had seen in its history, which Thomas verified with the authority of 23 years of comparison. Eli kept the accounts and kept them correctly, and when a discrepancy appeared in July, he found it himself and corrected it before Maggie had spotted it. And the look on his face when he told her was the look of a person discovering what they're genuinely capable of. The town of Harlow Creek had shifted in its opinion. Not completely, not uniformly. Towns never do. There were people who would always see Maggie Holloway Whitmore first through the lens of the woman who stepped off the train and struck them as wrong for the role. But there were more people who had sat at her table at the community supper she'd organized in March, who had bought her preserves at the general store where she'd arranged a small retail display, who had seen Caleb Whitmore walk through the town with his wife on his arm with the particular ease of a man who has stopped being alone and had revised their assessment accordingly. Harriet Clough stopped Maggie on the main street in June and said, in the tone of someone paying a debt she'd been avoiding, I did not fairly assess the situation when I came to your ranch last year. No, Maggie said, you didn't. Harriet had not expected the direct agreement. She recalibrated. I was given a particular perspective, she said. I know, Maggie said. I don't hold it against you. Harriet looked at her. You should a little, she said. It might make me more careful next time. Maggie looked back at her. Then I'll hold it against you a little, she said. Consider yourself warned. Harriet blinked, then she almost smiled. Good day, Mrs. Whitmore, she said. Good day, Mrs. Clough, Maggie said. It was Eli who told her about Victoria. He told her in August, in the kitchen, in the early morning, with the directness of someone who had decided information, ought to be conveyed clearly rather than carefully. He said that he had heard in town that Victoria Langley was leaving Harlow Creek, moving to her sister's property in Colorado. The house was listed for sale. Maggie stirred the pot. "How do you feel about that?" Eli said. She thought about this honestly. Relieved, she said. And something else. Something that isn't happy about it, exactly.
You feel sorry for her?
Eli said with the disbelief of 17. "I feel sorry for anyone who spends years wanting something they can't have," she said. "That's not a good way to live. I hope Colorado is better for her." Eli processed this. "You're a strange woman, Mrs. Whitmore," he said. "So I've been told," she said. She told Caleb that night. He was quiet for a moment. "Then I should write her a letter," he said. Maggie looked at him. He thought about the right words. "Not about any of it. Just wishing her well. We were friends once, before all of this." She deserves to leave with that acknowledged. She looked at him for a long time. "Yes," she said, "she does." He wrote the letter the following morning. He didn't show it to Maggie, and she didn't ask to see it, because some things between people belong to those people, and she understood where the boundaries of her knowledge should rest. He sent it with the post, and that was the end of Victoria Langley and the Whitmore Ranch. Finished not with confrontation or triumph, but with the ordinary human courtesy of a man who had once been someone's friend, acknowledging that the friendship had meant something before everything else complicated it. On a September morning 1 year and 1 month after Maggie Holloway stepped off a train in Harlow Creek, Montana, she stood at the stove in the kitchen of the Whitmore Ranch and made breakfast for 12 men. The stove ran clean. The pantry was full and organized. The account books were balanced and current. Outside the window, the yard was already busy. Thomas Reed moving from the barn in his deliberate way, Eli going to the hen house, Frank checking the porch step he'd replaced the previous week, Pete heading to the kitchen garden to check the late summer harvest. Del Purvis came through the kitchen door first, as he had started doing. Not to be early, but because he had discovered that arriving first meant a brief window of kitchen quiet that he had, without admitting it to anyone, come to value. He poured his coffee. He said, "Morning," Maggie said. He drank his coffee at the counter and didn't say anything else, but the silence between them was the comfortable kind. The kind that exists between people who have found a working peace that neither of them entirely expected and both of them intend to keep. The others came in. The table filled. The noise and movement of 12 men sitting down to a meal built itself into the particular music she knew by heart, every voice in its place, every hunger accounted for. Every tired body getting what it needed to face another day of work it could be proud of. Caleb came in last. He always came in last now. Not because he was delayed, but because he had learned that the best view of what mattered in his house was from the doorway, looking in at all of it, the table, the men, the food, and the woman at the stove who had made all of it possible. He came to the table. He looked at her. She looked back. Across the table, Thomas Reed lifted his coffee cup. "Another good year," he said. And at the kitchen table of the Whitmore Ranch, surrounded by 12 men who had arrived as strangers and become something as close to family as any of them had known in a long time. Maggie Holloway Whitmore, the woman they had judged before they knew her name, the woman who was too much and not enough by every standard except the one that actually mattered. The woman who had walked into a broken kitchen with a suitcase and a recipe box and decided that these people deserved someone who would give a damn whether they came home. Hungry, Maggie looked at all of it and knew with the quiet certainty of someone who has built something real with her own 2 hands, that the world was full of women who arrived in places and were told they didn't fit. And that the most powerful thing such a woman could do was not to argue and not to perform, and not to shrink herself into a shape that other people found easier to accept. The most powerful thing she could do was what Maggie had always done. Walk into the kitchen, start the fire, feed the people, and let the work speak for itself until every person in the room understood, bone deep and without possibility of doubt, that the woman they had underestimated was not the woman they had seen on that platform with her old suitcase and her quiet face and her body that didn't match their idea of who belonged in this place. She was the reason this place was worth belonging to. She always had been. They just hadn't known it yet. Ilko Vietlai van Hook Mike Vangungon Dung Noise Ko Chuin, Va Phi Kak Kako Chuin Kak. She didn't say a word. She just walked past every man who laughed at her, straight into that filthy kitchen, and she lit the stove. Nobody helped her, nobody offered. 12 ranch hands stood outside that door and made their jokes about the big woman Caleb Whitmore had ordered from a letter agency like she was a piece of furniture that had arrived in the wrong size. She heard every word. She cooked anyway. And by 6 the next morning, when those same 12 men walked into the dining room expecting another plate of burnt nothing, they stopped cold. The smell alone shut every one of them up. Thomas Reed, 22 years on that ranch, the man who had said that's her. Then, like a verdict, the moment she stepped off the train, he sat down, took one bite, and didn't speak again until his plate was empty. Then he asked for more. Nobody laughed after that. But that was only the beginning, because a woman named Victoria Langley had spent 4 years planning to be the next Mrs. Whitmore, and she had a banker in her pocket, a land commissioner's wife on speed, and absolutely no intention of letting a quiet, plus-size woman from a letter agency take what she believed was hers. What happened next on the Whitmore Ranch would force every single person in Harlow Creek, Montana, to answer one question they had never thought to ask themselves. What exactly do you see when you look at a woman like Maggie? If this is your first time here, please subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss a story. Drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far Maggie's story travels. Now stay with me, because this woman is about to do something nobody on that ranch will forget for the rest of their lives.